There is some fiscal savings still out there, but most of that has been spent. As quickly as that arrived in Americans' mailboxes, we were willing to go out into the marketplace and buy goods and services, take that vacation, buy that new car. That being said, the consumer didn't fall off a cliff when we concluded that fiscal stimulus, and that's because there was some additional pandemic savings. But we've also seen consumers turn to other inorganic measures, an intergenerational wealth transfer, or consumers turning to 401ks with hardship withdrawals up double digits since the start of the year. And of course, surprise, surprise, turning to credit cards with outstanding balances over $1.1 trillion. But that being said, we've also seen some organic support to the consumer, which is more of a welcomed, potentially medium or longer term support to the consumer scenario. With disinflation setting in, painfully slow, but setting in, we have seen real wages turn positive. So there is some ongoing support to the consumer that can continue to perpetuate this resilient thesis, even now in the absence of that fiscal stimulus.
Lindsay, yesterday we didn't get a ton of substance, but we did hear the candidates talk about tax cuts, entitlement spending, tariffs. Do you have a sense, a base case of what we can see fiscally in 2025?
Well, I think regardless of the candidate that comes into power, we're going to face a number of challenges in this country, turning the page into 25. We're going to continue to face sizable labor shortages. We're going to continue to face a massive divide between asset holders and non-asset holders. We continue to face elevated prices, massive budget deficits, not to mention international and geopolitical risks. So in many ways, the U.S. economy is poised to face sizable challenges, regardless of whether this is a second-round Biden or second-round Trump administration.
Lindsay, wonderful to get your view on the programme. Lindsay Piegza there of Stifel. A final word there on fiscal policy in 2025. We could talk about fiscal policy in 2024 in France. That sell-off in French bonds going into the weekend continues. That spread between France and Germany now gapping out to about 85, 86 basis points this morning, Lisa.
And this comes as the French 10-year yield rises to the highest of 3.3%. That is something coming out of basically the political uncertainty in that region that's frankly been dragging down all of Western Europe assets. This question of, is this sort of existential for the Euro region? How much does this really highlight the populist trend? And how different is that region than the United States?
There's so much political uncertainty and governance issues in places like France, places like the UK in the last couple of years, places like the United States. But to your point, the distinction I think we're all drawing this morning is there's very different fallout in places like France, in the gilt market of a year or so ago, than we're seeing, say, in treasuries.
It's a much bigger market in the United States. And honestly, Julian Emmanuel nailed it. The United States is a growth market. It has been the home place for a lot of the big tech behemoths that have been driving a lot of innovation. Can it continue to be the leader? You wonder how much the new ambassadors are the leaders of NVIDIA, are the leaders of Amazon, are the leaders of Apple, and you see that again and again. And why? Because those are the companies that are actually driving U.S. exceptionalism, not the political sphere.
Let's talk about some of the companies that aren't. Nike in the pre-market down about 15%. That's your bolting horse. Here are some barn doors for you. Price target, Nike cut to 90 from 100 at Jefferies, to 81 from 99 at Truist. Neutral, that's the new move, cut over at UBS. Price target 78, just repeatedly just dropping headline after headline in the last 12 hours.
I mean, you think about how much Jordans cost. You think about how popular they were just 3 years ago with many people's offspring, including mine, looking to spend astronomical amounts on them and then walking like they were on the moon to keep them from getting creased so they could resell them. That era has shifted. You now see other shoes in the forefront, and when it comes to Nike, they aren't able to regain that in the sports world, in particular with running.
Yeah, you mentioned this earlier, and you're right. Let's park the Air Jordan stuff. This is about the bread and butter, the roots, the foundations of this company. It's running. There's been a boom in running, and they've not been a part of it at all.
There was an anecdote that I was reading from a runners club, and they said that Hoka and On, they had their representatives at their meetings. They gave them free food after their runs. They gave them free drinks. They said, here, try these out. And guess what? Hoka and On are the new running shoes, and you see that consistently across every running group that you see in Central Park.
You see it in the share price. Year to date, On holding up 44%. Nike's down about 13%. You're going to get more pain a little bit later around the opening bow, given the indication we're getting in the pre-market and the early pre-market performance. Coming up next on this programme, in the second hour of Bloomberg Surveillance, we'll catch up with PIMCO's Libby Cantrell. We'll speak to Bob Dole of Crossmark, former World Bank President David Malpass with lots to say on fiscal policy in America, and Morgan Stanley's Michael Kushner. All of that still to come in the second hour of Bloomberg Surveillance, live from New York City this morning. Good morning.
It's the world's second largest economy with a growing influence in global affairs. But geopolitical uncertainties, deflationary pressures, and questions about foreign investment linger. Bloomberg, the China Show, brings you the unmatched expertise you need to keep track of breaking news, in-depth market analysis, and the most influential newsmakers in and around China. Bloomberg, the China Show. Weekdays around the world, right here on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
One of my greatest advantages, I own my company 100%. No board of directors. I make a decision, we move. And I had a guy say to me, runs a big media company. This guy ran a major division, Warner Discovery. Okay. It was just Warner Media at that time. He says, you know what, when we sit in our meetings, we don't talk about Disney. We don't talk about Paramount. We don't talk about Sony. He goes, you know who we talk about? I go, who? You. I said, really? He goes, yeah, you. I go, why? He goes, we are giant battleships, and you're like a little speedboat. And if there's gold on the beach, you run rings around us, get to the beach, take the gold, and by the time we turn our battleship around, you've already taken the gold. I go, that's right. I'm always gonna be that entrepreneur. I started my company from my dining room table 30 years ago. 30 years ago. And I started by calling every television station, asking them to carry my once-a-week show. On average, they all said no 50 times, and I worked through about 50,000 no's to get 150 yeses. That guy that was at that dining room table trying to pay his phone bill is that same guy today, 30 years later. That fire is still in my belly. I still run scared, and I'm still running after that vision of building the world's biggest media company.
Welcome to the world of decentralized finance.
With a surge in Bitcoin, you have crypto stocks also surging.
Bloomberg's covering all things crypto, the people.
This is a political attack, and we must hold our elected officials accountable.
The transactions.
Really a record-breaking moment.
Bitcoin is the exit strategy.
And the technology.
Awareness is going to grow, and these things grow the overall industry.
Crypto as an asset class is here to stay.
Bloomberg Crypto, only on Bloomberg.
Or other authorities.
Could face bigger challenges next.
Was going to keep Green World Cup. This is a three.
As the economic picture.
Covering the intersections of Hollywood, Silicon Valley, and beyond.
Generally speaking, the trend in inflation is lower.
I really don't think inflation is going to pick back up. I think that it's slowing. They're going to keep slowing.
Markets, trying to figure out what the Fed's going to do next, and it's pretty difficult because it's very much data dependent.
There's a lot of data between now and September. If we see inflation coming down, if we see the labor market continue to cool, they're going to go in September.
We think things should slow down. We think inflation's coming down as well, and taken together, that allows the Fed to cut.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Jonathan Ferro, Lisa Abramowitz, and Anne-Marie Hordern.
Live from New York City this morning. Good morning, good morning. The second hour of Bloomberg Surveillance begins right now with the equity market positive by 1/3 on the S&P 500. There is one word you've heard repeatedly over the last 12 hours associated with Democrats. Lisa, that word is panic.
Panic after a sad debate, and a lot of people saying that right now there are a lot of questions within the Democratic Party about whether Joe Biden has the resilience to run to have a second term, let alone to serve all 4 years if elected.
These comments were whispers behind closed doors, and now the Democratic Party is having these moments, this conversation with themselves out in the open, which is why many people are saying this is malpractice that they got to this point. This debate was supposed to be a moment of recalibration for the president, and all it's done is aggravate the concerns about his age at 81 years old. Can he do another 4 years?
It is late June. It is early to be having these discussions, but we're having these discussions because he wanted to have this debate in late June. He wanted to have this debate as early as we've just had it.
He wanted to turn the sentiment, and the question now is, how high is the bar within his own party to turn the sentiment in his camp? To turn the sentiment about how feasible it is and whether the popularity right now in the polls, the Snap poll from this election saying that 67% of that Snap poll by CNN saying that Donald Trump won that debate, is that enough to be a gut check for the people around Joe Biden to really say, wait a second, we need something else to figure out how to proceed?
We have already drawn a pretty strong distinction, a difference between what is happening politically in America and what isn't happening in financial markets. Markets are doing okay. There's no drama on this screen this morning. Where you are seeing a little bit of political drama is over in France. It's a completely different story. When you have political risk come to the surface in places like France, you see it in their domestic market. You see it in French bonds this morning.
You can see the yield on French bonds, the highest relative to German bonds of the similar denomination going back to 2012. So here's the question. How different is France from the United States? You know, how vulnerable are they to some sort of increased spending and increased deficit in a way that the United States is not? And how much does this have legs? You know, this is sort of a question we've talked to a lot of people who say they're investing in France. Okay, at what point do they actually step in? Because right now we're seeing outflows, and right now we're seeing that yield continue to gap out.
Will the United States retain that unique privilege of being able to behave recklessly for another 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years, even decades?
Julian Emmanuel nailed it. He basically said that so far, it has been the big tech giants and the growth kind of energy of the U.S. economy that has allowed the U.S. to remain immune to a lot of political risks. Does that change is really a key question, especially at a time where there are some real policy shifts on tariffs, where there are real policy shifts on taxes, and these are some of the issues that we did not hear about last night, even though a lot of us wanted to.
We did hear about it slightly on the margins, a little bit of substance, but really yesterday, of course, was about style. Of course, the other issue and the big question, and this is a feature of the U.S., not necessarily a flaw, is that we need the makeup of Congress as well to know how much we can see whether or not it's Trump or Biden. What can they enact? What kind of fiscal spending can they do? It really depends on Congress for a lot of these questions. And maybe that's a check right now. And maybe that's what the market's also reading into.
The biggest debate we had yesterday evening was over golf handicaps. For those of you that missed this debate, that was the biggest debate. The most heated that debate actually became was over their golf handicaps.
They actually looked at each other and engaged when they were talking about
time.
their golf game. Not taxes, not foreign policy, not inflation, not the border, their golf game. They looked at each other and they said, I'll meet you on, what do you call it, the pitch?
No, but we'll leave that there. The course. The course. Maybe leave the sporting analogies behind, AMH. Okay, I'm going to move on. Equities right now in the S&P 500 look a little something like this. Equities at the moment positive by 0.4%. If Biden can come back from that, you can come back from that too. Coming up this hour, we'll catch up with Libby Cantrell of PIMCO, breaking down the first presidential debate. Bob Dole of Crossmark ahead of the Fed's preferred inflation print, and former World Bank President David Malpass on the economic consequences of the election. We begin with our top story. President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump clashing in Atlanta, and the Democratic Party is looking for a backup plan.
We had the greatest economy in the history of our country. Unemployment rate rose to 15%. It was terrible until we get the total ban on the total initiative relative to what we're going to do with more Border Patrol and more asylum officers. I really don't know what he said at the end of that sentence. I don't think he knows what he said either. How many billions of dollars do you owe in civil penalties for molesting a woman in public, for doing a whole range of things, of having sex with a porn star on the night while your wife was pregnant? I didn't have sex with a porn star. The only person on this stage is a convicted felon is the man I'm looking at right now. When he talks about a convicted felon, his son is a convicted felon. You're the sucker. You're the loser. Dealing with everything we have to do with, look, if we finally beat Medicare.
Libby Cantrell of PIMCO joins us around a table. Libby, how does the President of the United States come back from that?
Well, that is, I think, the question for a lot of Democratic strategists and for the White House. You know, interestingly, John, you know, even though I think we all saw the same debate, and you know, arguably the president really did not meet the very low expectations that were established for him by President Trump. The Biden campaign is acknowledging that he, as Vice President Kamala Harris said, he had a slow start, but he finished strong. This is one debate. There will be another opportunity for another debate on September 10th. I doubt that debate happens at this point, honestly. So I think that they are, they are at least indicating that this is going according to plan. And I just think from a process perspective, it's really important to keep in mind here that there is no, party elder in the back room smoking a cigar deciding who the next Democratic nominee is going to be. This is Joe Biden. Joe Biden will be the nominee unless he steps down, unless he decides, really in the next 2 weeks or so, that he is no longer going to run. That has to be his decision. That is nobody else's decision. That is not the donor's decision. It is not the Democratic strategist's decision. That has to be Joe Biden's decision. And then even then, there is no consensus candidate. So the thing that the Democrats risk here is that if they don't, if Joe Biden does decide not to run, that there could just be chaos, and that then undermines their whole pitch to the American people that they are the party of stability. But it was very objectively an incredibly bad night for the president.
You've indicated to us repeatedly that a lot of the questions you get asked is about who is going to ultimately be the candidate for the Democrats. And the words that you hear repeatedly from clients is not Joe Biden. You hear things like Michelle Obama. Even Jamie Dimon, I think you shared with us a number of months ago. What do those conversations sound like now, particularly yesterday evening?
Yeah, well, I would say that our traders had lots of ideas, had lots of views last night, and were sharing them with me, in a very generous way. I would put it that. I think that of course that narrative, John, is going to is going to reach a fevered pitch if it hasn't already. I just think people have to really understand, though, that there is a process here that the Democratic Party has established, and they have put their thumb on the scale. Joe Biden is going to be their nominee again, unless the President of the United States takes him out. This can only be his decision. I just can't reinforce that enough. So yes, I do. I think that the narratives around Michelle Obama and Jamie Dimon are going to just accelerate for sure. But I don't think that changes the reality that this is likely what this is. And if it's not going to be, the decision has to be made really within the next week or so.
Libby, you brought up the fact that Biden camp is saying he finished strong. Arguably, he didn't. He didn't even end with a real pitch to the American people, didn't bring up abortion, which is supposed to be all this money they're going to spend on to try to get out the vote. At the same time, I'm sure your phone was blowing up like mine, with Democrats saying this is an unmitigated disaster. Do you see a schism now between Democrats and the White House and the campaign?
Well, I do think that the down ballot Democrats, and we've talked about this before, that of course the Democrats are much more vulnerable in the U.S. Senate. They only control the Senate by one vote right now. 23 of the 34 seats are being defended by Democrats. Of those 23, 8 are vulnerable. So for those folks, Anne-Marie, who are in these vulnerable races in the Senate and then also in the House, of course, I think that the Democrats are hoping that they can flip the House. There is a lot of concern that even though the polling shows that those Democrats are actually outperforming Biden by a pretty significant margin, that Biden's performance last night will just continue to weigh on not only on him but on their candidacy. But again, I just think this is. The reality here is this is very difficult to change at this late in the game. This was not some sort of, again, just to go into the conspiracy theories, this was not some plan by the Democrats to show Joe Biden's weakness and then to try to change the ticket. I think this was a mistake. This was sort of a political miscalculation. They really were, as you said earlier, they were really trying to reset the race. They wanted this. They set the terms for the debate. They were hoping that this would be able to recalibrate, and it's not. And I think from a market's perspective, let's see what happens. I mean, there was some discussion about tariffs yesterday. There was some sort of brief discussion about deficits. I didn't hear anything about that either candidate is going to be, there's going to be any fiscal consolidation, right? They did not talk about deficit reduction. Only thing they did talk about was reinforcing the importance of Medicare and Social Security and not touching those entitlement programs. And as we know, that's a big source of the deficit. So maybe the market starts pricing in some of the tariff risk that they've been sort of ignoring at this point. Maybe yields, maybe the yield curve starts normalizing a little bit with the sort of the expectation that we're going to see even more spending.
Yeah, yields are up a couple of basis points. 4.28% yesterday on the 10-year. Today it's 4.3%. Woof, big fear, especially compared to to what's going on in French bond markets. We talk a lot about Biden this morning. We didn't talk about Trump. We didn't talk about the fact that it was really the focus on Biden, but it wasn't, though, Trump really presenting this stellar performance. I am wondering about what this does to embolden him with respect to his choices for vice president, whether he leans more to a populist rather than a centrist, whether he feels like he has more of a mandate to cater more to the fringes in a way, because there is a sort of a vacuum on the other side of the ticket.
Yeah, I think it's a great point. If Joe Biden did not meet the very low expectations that were established for him, I think arguably President Trump did outperform expectations. He was more disciplined than certainly he was in those first debates in 2020. He was more moderated. I actually think the format probably helped him, the fact that the mics were being muted. But I do think your point about vice president, it puts us in sharper focus now, because folks are now, because of concerns around Biden's age, are going to make this much more of a referendum on the vice president than even it was before. And as a result, who Trump's vice president is going to be is probably even more important as well, because that debate that is likely to happen either in end of July or August is going to be, again, more important. So I do think that this was a win for President Trump. As we all know, debates are more performative. They're more about sort of performance than they are about style. And I think on style, he definitely won.
All right. So you also said that the fiscal is coming into focus, and I want to get a sense from you, given what we didn't hear yesterday, which is any discussion about taming this. How long can the United States remain, as John has mentioned many times before, in this place of being able to have the privilege of acting recklessly? How long before the U.S. starts to feel the same pressure that France does?
Yeah, I mean, I think that is the big question for sure. Again, we've talked about this many times, that you can't replace something with nothing. And the fact that the U.S. is the reserve currency, the fact that the Treasury is the reserve asset of the world, the fact that central banks still hold treasuries, that the fact that they still have this flight to quality characteristics. I mean, all of this just sort of speaks to the fact that this privilege is still extended to the United States. And what we do expect, though, and what we're telling our clients, is that while we're not expecting the bond vigilantes necessarily to come back and to sort of enforce, spending restraints on Washington anytime soon, we would expect that there would be some term premium that would increase at the long end of the curve, right? So right now, the curve has been flat, inverted for the last 2 years. You haven't, as an investor, been getting that premium to hold longer dated paper with deficits. And I think this is interesting. This didn't really come up last night, but the CBO last week upgraded their deficit projections for the United States, and that they're numbers that are just really, pretty surprising. They're 6%, 7%, 8%. You add back the cost of the Trump tax cuts if and when they get extended, and then you're talking about 8% deficits. And yet the markets don't really move. So we are expecting the markets to sort of internalize this at some point and be reflected again in increasing term premium at the long end of the curve. But in terms of the reserve currency status, the reserve asset status, that does not seem like it's going away, because as we've been mentioning, I mean, look at the other developed countries. Look at the alternatives, right? As we've talked about a lot, Bill Gross's, assertion about the cleanest dirty shirt. The U.S. is the cleanest dirty shirt. It's not clean, but it's a lot less dirty than a lot of the other alternatives are.
The best thing about treasuries this morning, they're not French bonds. I mean, that's kind of it, right? But what Libby said, I think, is absolutely vital. Deutsche Bank had talked about this as well. The extent to which America is going to go on to pursue a very aggressive protectionist trade policy is something you have to take much more seriously this morning, based after what we saw last night.
Even an independent government agency, as Libby was talking about, is ringing the alarm bells and saying that we're going to see deficits unlike what we have ever seen in our history, that is akin to more of an emerging market. And nobody's really noticing it, saying we'll be able to work it out. When do they start to notice?
Libby, thank you. It's good to see you. Thank you. A focus on the process. Libby Cantrell of PIMCO. Let's get you an update on stories elsewhere this morning. Here's your Bloomberg brief with Danny Berger. Hey, Danny.
Hey, John. A check on Nike this morning, down 14.5%. Its full-year outlook fell short of expectations. The company said that revenue would decline in the mid-single digits this fiscal year. The company's been struggling to churn out lifestyle wear with little offerings to replace their previous top sellers like Air Force Ones and Dunks. Instead, rivals have picked up the slack, like Adidas, whose retro Samba sneaker are fueling a new era of growth. The judge who scrapped Elon Musk's $56 billion Tesla pay package will hold a hearing on whether a recent shareholder vote to revive the deal should affect her decision. The Delaware Chancery Court may take judicial notice of the vote, but it's not obligated to recognize the results. Tesla has argued that the vote addresses many of the concerns that the judge raised in her decision. Boeing getting yet another round of criticism, this time from the National Transportation Safety Board. The NTSB said that Boeing provided, quote, misleading and inaccurate information to the public in a media briefing this week, that briefing surrounding their 737 MAX incident in January. In a letter sent to CEO Dave Calhoun, the regulator said that Boeing blatantly violated the agency's rules about active investigations. The NTSB said that it would therefore revoke Boeing's access to investigative information as the probe continues. And that's your Bloomberg Brief. John.
Danny, thank you. More from Danny in about 30 minutes. Up next on the programme, heading for 3 straight quarters of gains.
For the most part, we have been concerned about valuation on the one hand, yet have been, I would say, among the largest proponents of the game-changing nature of AI for well over a year.
That conversation just around the corner, live from New York City this morning. Good morning.
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand webinars, only from Bloomberg. Start exploring to see what's moving the markets. Visit Bloomberg.com/webinars.
Okay, today I'm going to talk about how to succeed with a startup. Obviously, more than can be said here in 20 minutes, but I will do the best I can. The most important thing, the number one lesson we try to teach startups is that the degree to which you're successful approximates the degree to which you build a product that is so good, people spontaneously tell their friends about it. Startups always ask us for the secret to success. They always want to believe it's something other than this, because this is really hard to do. But this is it. If you can build a product that is so good, people spontaneously tell their friends about it, you have done 80% of the work that you need to be a really successful startup. If you think about the most successful companies you know, Google, Facebook, whatever, you probably found out about them because a friend of yours said, you got to try this, it's great. So this is the bar. Something that people love so much they tell their friends about it. One important indicator for a product like that is a product that's simple to explain and easy to understand. If you can't explain in a few words what you do, and if at least some people don't say, oh, that's pretty interesting, that's usually a mistake. It's usually a sign of unclear thinking or a need that is not big enough.
I want a bank that shows me what I spend instantly.
We're Monzo. Give us a go. See?
I want a bank that can help me budget for the things I need, like a new leather jacket for Bingo.
We can do that.
Bingo's my cockapoo.
Hi, Bingo.
It's a real faff to sign up.
It takes less than 10 minutes.
Race you.
You're on. Time's up. How'd you get on?
It's a draw.
Is it? We hear you, Bingo. You make Monzo Monzo.
Signs that the economy is slowing, and that would surprise a lot of people who are expecting earnings growth double digits this year and double digits next year.
That's not even a question for me, whether we're going to go take a swing at building the next thing. I'm just incapable of not doing that. There's a bunch of times when we wanted to launch features, and then Apple's just like, nope, you're not launching that. I was like, that sucks. Are we set up for that with AI, where you're going to get a handful of companies that run these closed models that are going to be in control of the APIs and therefore are going to be able to tell you what you can build? Then when you start getting into building a data center that's like 300 megawatts or 500 megawatts or a gigawatt, just no one has built a single gigawatt data center yet. From wherever you sit, there's going to be some actor who you don't trust. If they're the ones who have like the super strong AI, I think that that's potentially a much bigger risk.
We just haven't seen it at the headline payroll numbers yet, and I emphasize yet.
I guess when you talk about the potential for some sort of downdraft at a time where momentum can also keep climbing, how do you hedge? How do you hedge downturn at a time where we were just talking about deficits in the United States, when we're talking about the potential for the Fed to really confront both an increasing deficit but also protracted entrenched inflation? Bob, do you basically barbell it, or is the barbell basically gold and then NVIDIA?
Yeah, I think you have to play the game. A momentum market is not one to stand in front of. It's like standing in front of a freight train. You don't know when momentum's going to end. There are no good predictors there. So you be careful what you own. You own companies that you have high confidence in their earnings predictability, earnings persistence, good cash flow stories. There are plenty of them. Those stocks have done fine on the upside, but should we get any kind of setback, I think those stocks will go down less. That's how you play the game.
Your conclusion is that risk on will persist. Bob, I have to ask, given the performance we saw last night by the sitting president, do you ignore what is happening in Washington?
Well, I have to take market cues. Markets tend not to pay attention to elections till after Labor Day. You get the conventions, the running mates, come back from the beach, and after Labor Day, now let's focus on the election 2 months from now. This is so unusual with this debate so much up front. I think the market, with the futures shrugging, doesn't make a whole lot of difference yet. And look, but both guys are not spring chickens. I wish I heard last night a lot more about what they're going to do in the next 4 years. It was all about, you're a sucker. No, you're the worst president in history. Let's talk about the future, not the past.
And some questions about just how low that golf handicap actually is. Bob, let's have that serious conversation. 6, I mean, it's a stretch. When he said 6, okay, let's leave that there. Yeah, it's a stretch.
I've seen your swing, and you're not a 6.
Yeah, I thought the same thing. But let's leave that there. Bob, I want to talk about the market. Where do you think in financial markets you would look to begin to focus on the prospect of a second term for Donald Trump? A much more aggressive trade policy, what that would mean for, say, foreign exchange, the US dollar, the prospect of extending the tax cuts from 2017, what that would mean for fixed income. When would you begin to start to focus on that a little bit more?
I think we have to do our homework now. I think the market will focus on it to repeat after Labor Day. I'm glad you folks talked about this in the earlier segment, but it's pretty clear if it is Trump, we're going to have a hawkish foreign policy, a more protectionist, if it's a Republican sweep, which it very well could be, the extension of the Trump tax cuts, all of that is interest rate upward mobility, and I think we will see some of that. On the other hand, if we get more of this economic slowdown, that at least for a brief time could work in the other direction.
You know a 20 handicap when you see one, don't you, Bob? It's got to catch up. Bob Dole, across from Mark. Bob, thank you. Bramo, these are things we have to take seriously, and sure, you can make the point that it's important, the makeup of Congress, what all that means for fiscal policy. When it comes to trade, that stuff doesn't matter. That's something we can talk about right now.
Especially given the fact that there are some similarities between both presidential candidates. I just think about how the risks are so bifurcated. it's sort of one asset class could do either really well or really poorly, depending on who wins and what their policies are.
Coming up on the program, we'll continue this conversation. We'll catch up with the former World Bank President David Malpass on a potential second term for Donald Trump. That's next.
The idea of being, quote, I mean, you're not going to be the CEO of this company, of being, quote, commercial. You know, a lot of artistes, if you will, would use the word commercial as a pejorative of sorts.
That's why they're still in apartment buildings, you know, trying to pay them. I mean, the truth is, I've never viewed that's something that people say when they get, you know, artists sort of get competitive and want to sort of have a little interesting argument, but that's not relevant. The truth is, at least in my view, no, we're not raising money to make inscrutable black and white Polish art films that are impressionistic, because there's not an audience for that. There's probably not an audience for that in Poland. I see no differentiation between commercial and quality. You'd ask Reed Hastings, hey, well, we went for quantity. I suppose to establish a footprint. I'm sure there's some wisdom in that, and I'm sure they had a great strategy. I would have said, how do you make 50 good movies a year? How is that possible? There is no committee big enough. There aren't enough. You just can't do it. It's a thing that requires attention and dedication and work, and it resists the sort of assembly line process. Scott Stuber is a really talented, smart guy I really like. And I thought to myself, boy, he is really, it's an impossible job. You know, first of all, because the ratio of any number of movies you make, even when you're trying your best and you have the best people, you're still slightly less apt to fail than you are to succeed. But you're really setting yourself, now the way the market's changed, where they go, okay, fewer movies quality, we're in luck. It happens to benefit us. But the truth is, I know people tend to see the business in very short-term, sort of market-based, in a market-based perspective. The truth is, over the long run, you see more people watching things, more people paying for content, more people spending money on content. So that's the direction of the audience that it's going. How it is that they get it, how it is that they pay for it, whether the subscriber model is one that will ultimately exist long-term. What people are going to do is seek out content. I'm of the belief that if you continue to endeavor at your highest priority, no matter what, is to do something good, that more or less is commercial. It doesn't mean I'm obtuse to ideas like, okay, well, look, there's a bigger audience for action movies than there is for small dramas. I would not have $120 million for Armageddon and $18 million for Good Will Hunting. I sort of get that, you know, because certain genres play more broadly. You can't be not mindful of that. But you also, any of those genres of movies can be better. That would be my argument. But let's do a good one. Let's make it smart. Let's have it be interesting. Let's surprise the audience. Let's make them care about it. I know you can get people to watch people shooting each other and things blowing up because they're stoned and it's 2 in the morning and they're flipping through Netflix. But let's aim a little higher than that. You know what I mean? Let's try to find something that people remember 20 years later, because that is what makes this business so much bigger optically. Why people talk about Hollywood so much more than they talk about Walmart. Walmart has 6% of the American workforce. It's gigantic. It doesn't show up in the papers every day, though. You know what I mean? It's not. This is the thing. This is our biggest export, our culture, what we believe in, how we tell stories. Storytelling is the way people learn to communicate. It's probably how, you know, Neanderthals became Homo sapiens. Really, truly, the ability to communicate with one another meant, well, we'll just gang up on the Neanderthals because now we have names for each other and we can organize and got rid of the.
We're up by 0.8%. In the bond market, 2-year, 10-year, 30-year shaping up as follows. The 10-year up by a basis point to 430. The 2-year at 471.82. I have to say, Lisa, the Fed talk's gone a bit quiet. It's gone quiet, hasn't it?
Well, we get a number of people who are going to speak today. We've got Mary Daly, Michelle Bowman. We've got others who are going to be speaking. That said, in terms of the message, it hasn't been market moving. It is fascinating to me how stable yields have been over the past couple of weeks. We were talking about 20 basis point swings. We're not doing that anymore, and I think that that is a notable shift.
Let's talk about stability. Can we find some? Dollar yen, switch up the board, 160.62. The high of the session, 161.27. You know, Lisa, you nailed it yesterday. We talked about this a few times, the concerns about 140, 150. Don't go there. 155, oh no, 160, 161. When's it going to stop?
You know, honestly, full disclosure, one of my progeny went on a trip to Japan, and I had to transfer some currency into yen.
And you were happy about it?
And I was waiting as long as I could because I was thinking maybe it would weaken more. But you just wonder, it's just moving quickly, and you wonder what's going to stop it, given the fact that you do have inflation, but you also have growth that's slowing in the region. So at what point do they bite the bullet and raise rates as soon as next month? This, to me, is really going to be an increasing kind of drumbeat heading into the Bank of Japan.
The rhetoric's still the same from the finance ministry. Rapid moves, one-sided moves. What we're all waiting to hear from the Bank of Japan, the central bank, is let's have a serious conversation about rate hikes. And I think that's what's really getting to what's happening in the FX market right now. It's just the same words, the same language, the threat of intervention, verbal intervention at the moment. The game changer is going to be when the BOJ actually starts having a serious conversation about hiking interest rates.
There have been a number of people who've come on this show and say, even when you look at the trade balances in the different economies, 160 seems like it's particularly weak for the yen versus the dollar. This is ultimately game theory, and this is a market betting that they cannot win unless they really shift policy on the monetary front, and they are betting that they will not do that, which is the reason why traders are shorting yen. At what point can they fly in the face of that and the Bank of Japan come out and say, we're going, we hear you, and we're not going to have it and go anymore?
Just want to know, because inquiring minds will inquire. Did you buy the yen? Have you done that?
Yeah, well, I mean,
that's taken place.
He's going. So.
Okay, great. So you did this at 160.
That's correct.
Quite a trade. Nice.
Thanks.
Well done. Congrats. All right. Under surveillance this morning, the U.S. military is moving assets closer to Israel and Lebanon as the risk for a full-blown war with Hezbollah grows. NBC News reporting forces are also preparing for the possible evacuation of U.S. citizens in Lebanon. This is the fear we've had for a number of months, the prospect that this war would spread across the region and include more bad actors, including Hezbollah. And this was a conversation we had yesterday with Amos Hochstein, advisor to the president.
Absolutely, and you can see what the U.S. is doing in making these moves. They're trying to set a different level of deterrence right now. What struck me is that they're talking to allies and planning, which is positive, but also how dire a situation that they're thinking that they need to evacuate American citizens. That would not look good on this administration, given the fact that they've had to evacuate American citizens for other instances as well, notably in Afghanistan. But really, for me, the marker was earlier this week. Lloyd Austin, the defense secretary, said exactly this. He said such a conflict could, quote, easily become a regional war with terrible consequences for the Middle East.
It just feels like there's a lot going on that we don't have visibility into, that in terms of negotiating and trying to quiet some of the tensions. Honestly, if this would become a conflagration that did engulf a broader swath of the region, you would expect a bigger market reaction. Right now, the market is expecting it to die down, regardless of the rhetoric and the bombs being shot and the fact that people have been displaced.
Yeah, Mohammed El-Erian talked about this, I think, in an FT piece a number of months ago, that the situation over there was kind of like boiling the frog. That people are just sort of ignoring it. You don't see much price action in the commodity market. You get that spread of that tension beyond the Gaza Strip to the northern frontier of Israel, involving things like Hezbollah, groups like Hezbollah, the risk that Iran gets involved directly as well. You can see how this can spiral in the wrong direction pretty quickly.
People talk about a significant risk premium that is not being baked in. I mean, this is not a small risk, and it only takes, one errant bomb to sort of create a real big problem. Right now, there's sort of a very careful calibration of not going ahead of their skis with every single sort of lobbed missile. When does that shift? The U.S. is having a big presence there, as Anne-Marie mentioned, to make sure it doesn't really escalate.
And that's the latest in the Middle East. This is the latest in France going into the weekend. Marine Le Pen's national rally continues to gain ground ahead of the French election on Sunday. Bloomberg's poll seeing the party rise to 36.2%. A leftist alliance called the New Popular Front is second at 28.3%. President Macron's centrist group is trailing at 20.4%. And you push all of that through the bond market, and you've got higher French bond yields and wider spreads relative to Germany. The wider the year, we are in the 80s now. We have said goodbye to the 70s.
It's the widest spread going back to 2012, the highest yields on French 10-year bonds, 3.3%. Going back to November at a time where people are looking at a France that has already been downgraded by the credit rating agencies and still is expecting to have more spending. It just goes to this question of the populist wave and what the ramifications are going to be for the markets, given the fact that everywhere other than the U.S. has seen some real moves as a result.
Well, let's talk about the United States and the main story front and center here. President Joe Biden and former President Donald Trump attacking each other on a range of issues, including on inflation and the economy. The former World Bank President David Malpass writing this in the Wall Street Journal: Mr. Biden has blamed everything except the actual cause: expensive regulations and massive government spending. Donald Trump's approach to inflation should be he returned to office, is likely to be different. Let markets produce more so that growth goes up and prices go down. David joins us now for more. David, wonderful to get your perspective on the program, sir. I'm sure you've read the letter that came from the 16 Nobel laureates earlier in the week, warning about the risks associated with the Trump presidency and how it would reignite inflation. What would you say back to that this morning?
That Trump was pretty clear on how you could get more growth, and that's going to have a big impact on whether you have inflation. I think, I don't want to say PhD economists are off base, but the group really has a model that hasn't been working. Think of all the huge mistakes that have been made on inflation forecasts in the past. So what we know is that Trump articulated this plan where you have more energy, that holds down prices, that allows interest rate cuts, and you have more growth within the economy. He was really clear on how do you get jobs for minorities. You cut off illegal immigration and you have more growth in the economy. I was surprised by the contrast with Biden, who was talking, it seemed like almost as a senator, talking about Pell Grants, talking about first-time homebuyer credits, the small things that aren't really getting to the core of the affordability crisis that we're in right now.
David, let's just go through some of the policies. Extending the 2017 tax cuts, potentially implementing a flat tariff. You've heard those same economists talk about why that would lead to higher inflation. On those two specific issues, why wouldn't they contribute to higher prices?
Yeah, I think if you raise taxes, you're going to get less production, and that actually will be inflationary. And Biden is proposing big tax increases, and that's factored into the growth forecasts that CBO put out. The deficit forecasts that they're projecting under Biden are dependent on the idea that the economy will stay slow growing into the future. Trump is really going the opposite way and saying, no, that's not the economy that we want. We want a better economy that would generate more tax revenues and also more prosperity for people.
David, this is something that we've just discussed before, and it's a controversial point, the idea that you can grow your way into the deficit by cutting taxes versus having to raise revenues. I don't want to have that debate right now. I do want to talk about the idea of tariffs and what that does going forward, which is something that Donald Trump could unilaterally do. Do you believe in your core that if the former president does become elected and does engage with pretty significant tariffs across the board, which he can do unilaterally, that if the market sells off, he would reverse course?
We've seen Biden continue the tariffs that were on China, and the market is able to digest a whole lot of things, as it's doing this morning. So I think the market adjusts to the policies, and the overall question is the U.S. going to be a strong player on the international scene? Trump talked, I thought, very effectively last night about Afghanistan and the disaster that created, and it's spilling over to all the other world situations. So you can create a better world by having an actual plan that's based on production. And so you're saying, what about tariffs? Well, there's a whole plan, or there are lots of things that can be done in the U.S. to really allow this strong economy to move forward.
Well, but David, just to sort of pick up on the tariff point and sort of what I was getting at, there is a belief in markets that potentially the former president would reverse course on tariffs that were highly negative for the market. A lot of people have come on the show and said a lot of the tariffs that have been proposed would increase inflation in this country and would actually create a real negative situation for a number of companies. Do you believe that if the market does sell off, that would provide a check to the former president and that he would reverse course?
Well, that's a real hypothetical. So really, I think what we have to do is over the next 5 months survive and then see how do you resolve some of the wars meaning resolve them quickly and allow energy production to start. And then as you look at tariffs, I think there needs to be a real rethink of how do we interact with China, who has been this giant overproducer or, very successful successful industrial producer that takes away jobs from the rest of the world. There needs to be a world discussion of that. You're seeing the politics in Europe, you were just referring to it, of people in Europe realizing that this cost on climate is really hurting their competitiveness. So Germany's economy is in deep trouble, in part because energy costs are so high. So that drives people to other answers to try to deal with and interact with China into the future. I think that'll be an important part of a new administration.
David, let's go where you almost went, though. What is the plan on tariffs? Are these just talking points right now, or is this a plan, if we were to get Trump to be president again, that is going to be 10% tariff wall for all imported goods and 50+ on Chinese imported goods?
You have to have a room with people in it, with lawyers in it, with what is the legislative process with it. So I think there will be a very detailed discussion of how do we protect, how do we have sectors in the U.S. that are able to stand up to subsidized production from abroad. And that's a valid discussion to have, should have been happening already, and needs to be done more deeply.
We had on Maya McGinnis today from the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget. I'm sure you know her well. And they put out some numbers this week about how President Trump approved $8.4 trillion of new 10-year borrowing during his full term. And Biden, during his first 3 years and 5 months, approved $4.3 trillion of new 10-year borrowing. Do you honestly think either of these individuals are not going to add a substantial amount of money to the deficit?
To the deficit. So let's talk about debt and deficit. If you have a faster growing economy, you won't have as big a deficit as Biden is projected to have. CBO is operating from the economic plan that's in place now, which is one where, and you heard it all last night in great detail, the government is going to be the solution for each thing, and interest rates are going to stay high for a long time because of the inflation. So if you project that out, you're going to get huge deficits into the future, which is what shows up in the CBO forecast. If you redo the forecast based on a growth program, you don't get those deficits. Now, I think there also has to be very strong restraint on spending. Washington is spending like crazy, and it's out into the future. It's every month. It's trillions of dollars going out the door. President Trump talked about the Paris Agreement costing $1 trillion. I think he's understating it. It's worse than that. So on the energy front alone, the subsidies and credits that are being put out on that side are super expensive. Some of that can be saved still, and the market will react positively if you say anything that causes them to think you're going to have some restraint. Right now, they're operating on the idea of no restraint, and that keeps interest rates high.
David, you're close to the campaign. It's all quiet on the VP front. Who should we be focused on, do you think?
No, I don't have that's up to President Trump. And I think what you saw last night is somebody that's going to make a lot of decisions on things. He landed a lot of blows, and one of them was that Biden hasn't fired anyone. This is a really important part of management and of governing, of choosing people, and Trump will have the chance to have really strong people in across the board, and I think that can really help. There just hasn't been enough strength within the U.S. administration that's operating now, and you see it in every policy meeting that I was in. You see it in the results that came out of those programs. It's not working, and so we need change.
David, it's great to catch up, sir, as always. I know we'll continue this conversation over the next 4 months or so. David Malpass, the former World Bank president, and maybe the future something in the next administration.
It sounds like definitely potential something in the next administration. You just wonder, this is sort of a key debate, and this is something David talked about, the idea of growing your way into growth. It sort of hinges on the whole idea of the trickle-down voodoo economics of the Reagan time versus something else. And the combination with the cuts, where would those cuts come from, right? And that's a key question. These are real questions that we can keep having into the debate.
Much more important questions, particularly after what took place yesterday evening. Let's get you an update on stories elsewhere this morning. We can do that with Danny Berger, as always, always, with your Bloomberg Brief. Hey, Danny.
Hey, John. Richmond Fed President Thomas Barkin said that the inflation battle still hasn't been won and that the U.S. economy will remain resilient as long as unemployment remains low and assets high. He is speaking at a conference in Paris, and Barkin said that the lagged effects from rate hikes are still playing out and that they will eventually slow the economy. Investors have a key read on the U.S. economy at 8:30 a.m. when PCE deflator hits the tape. Apple is reportedly exploring new options that would allow iPhone batteries to be more easily replaced by customers. The update follows a law passed by the EU last year that aims to protect consumers. According to the site The Information, at least one model of the iPhone 16 and potentially all iPhone 17s may get the new battery option. An Apple spokesperson declined to comment on the story. The NFL is facing a massive antitrust lawsuit after a jury sided with fans over pricey broadcast subscription costs. The league was hit with a $4.7 billion damage, which stands to be triple to $14 billion under federal law. Fans had claimed that the league conspired with DirecTV to raise the prices to watch out-of-market games. The league made the unusual decision to take the suit to trial, with Commissioner Roger Goodell appearing as a witness. A league spokesperson called the verdict disappointing and said the NFL plans to appeal. And that's your Bloomberg Brief, John.
Danny, thank you. Up next on the program, the data-dependent Fed.
Generally speaking, the trend in inflation is lower. Core PCE inflation is likely to be around 2.5% in May. I think they could probably be talked into a cut in September.
Was there a natural argument between you and Neil?
No, he just thought, your AMH is nodding.
Yes.
No, he called me out for cherry picking, and I said, everyone's cherry picking, and he said, you look at two data points, it's unemployment and inflation, that's it, period, full stop.
It got intense when he just looked down the barrel of the Zoom camera and said, Lisa, there's only two data points that matter.
Neil got intense. You should have seen Lisa's face. Off camera, that's always the money face. That one right there. I've said we need a Bravo cam for a long time.
I would act different.
Said it for a long time. From a beautiful New York, this is Bloomberg.
The top names in tech are on Bloomberg.
I don't like anthropomorphizing AI. I sort of
Okay, today I'm going to talk about how to succeed with a startup. Obviously, more than can be said here in 20 minutes, but I will do the best I can. The most important thing, the number one lesson we try to teach startups is that the degree to which you're successful approximates the degree to which you build a product that is so good, people spontaneously tell their friends about it. Startups always ask us for the secret to success. They always want to believe it's something other than this, because this is really hard to do. But this is it. If you can build a product that is so good, people spontaneously tell their friends about it, you have done 80% of the work that you need to be a really successful startup. If you think about the most successful companies you know, Google, Facebook, whatever, you probably found out about them because a friend of yours said, you got to try this, it's great. So this is the bar. Something that people love so much they tell their friends about it. One important indicator for a product like that is a product that's simple to explain and easy to understand. If you can't explain in a few words what you do, and if at least some people don't say, oh, that's pretty interesting, that's usually a mistake. It's usually a sign of unclear thinking or a need that is not big enough.
I want a bank that shows me what I spend instantly.
We're Monzo. Give us a go. See?
Well, I want a bank that can help me budget for the things I need, like a new leather jacket for bingo.
We can do that.
Bingo's my cockapoo.
Hi, Bingo.
It's a real faff to sign up.
It takes less than 10 minutes.
Race you.
You're on. Time's up. How'd you get on?
It's a draw.
Is it? We hear you, Bingo. You make Monzo Monzo.
Hi, I'm Laurie Haynes, CEO and co-founder of Shirar, and I'm really excited to tell you that we are going to be raising funds for Shirar again. After a successful raise in 2023, it's time to scale.
We hope that you enjoy the pitch deck and the financial model. Any questions, please don't hesitate to ask us, and we can't wait for you to be part of Shirar.
How you back out the Fed's reaction function. In those projections are unemployment core inflation, I think they could probably be talked into a cut in September.
So here's the latest. Futures gaining as focus turns from the debate to the data. The May PCE deflator due out in just over 30 minutes' time. Investors hoping it will solidify the case for a rate cut this year. Michael Kushner of Morgan Stanley writing this. The Fed is keen on a soft landing, but the big question is, have high interest rates done all they can do without creating too much pain? Michael joins us now for more. So Michael, right on cue, we've just heard from Mr. Barkin of the Richmond Fed, and he said the US economy is withstanding the Fed's battle on inflation. Neil Dutter, we just played some sound from him, he wrote in this morning and he said the economy, consumer, retail sales and food services are flat for 5 months. On housing, pending home sales are at fresh lows, new home sales are the lowest since November, CapEx, core capital goods orders and shipments are flat for 6 months. He says that Barkin's language is totally detached from reality. Michael, can we get your assessment on how detached from reality those comments are?
Well, I think it's your definition of reality. If you look at goods price inflation is close to back to zero, so that's worked. Interest rate sensitive sectors are struggling. Generally speaking, housing, construction, all those areas. So interest rates have done their job. They've brought demand and output down from the peaks we saw for the last couple of years. The areas where inflation has remained high, core services is somewhat immune to higher interest rates, except to the indirect effect of lower incomes, people spending less money. I'm sure you've been traveled recently. I've been traveling recently, and every plane is full. Business class, economy, everything. Can't change seats, can't change planes. So a lot of core services are still quite strong, and that spending is more a function of wealth than just worries about income, which is strong for most people. So I think it's the question for the Fed is that will keeping high rates high do the job of bringing inflation down sooner without causing too much damage in the interest rate sensitive sectors. And the problem there is that wealth creation still is rolling along. That household wealth is at record highs. So why is that going to slow down spending unless the unemployment rate drifts higher for the higher income people, 25 through 54-year-olds?
Michael, we have been talking all morning about politics, about long-term trends of deficits and potentially tariffs. We are 40 minutes away from what we've been building up to all week long, which is core PCE deflator, the key inflation metric, and personal income and personal spending. Which of these data points is going to be really important for you when you think about where rates should be, the Fed response mechanism, and where really we should be focusing?
Core PC is the Fed's preferred target. It is the most important number. There's a big gap between core CPI and core PCE. Core CPI went up a lot more than core PCE, has come down faster. The question is that gap going to close by core CPI coming down to core PCE? Is core PCE actually too low relative to core CPI? And that's going to drift higher over time, not higher, but higher relative to core CPI. So we see fewer improvement in core PCE. Core PCE tends to be stickier. I think that the numbers is coming down. The year-on-year numbers have been improving, but the year-on-year comparisons to last late summer, fall is going to be difficult to improve upon, considering how surprisingly low inflation was in the second half of last third of last year. So core PC is likely to keep coming down, but the gains are likely to get fewer and fewer over time. Then the question the Fed has to say is core CPI continuing to fall can put downward pressure, more pressure on core PC over the next couple of months. But I don't think core PC is a constraint on the Fed for cutting rates. It's more about the strength of the economy, and the unemployment rate is still pretty low.
Which goes to the personal income level and what we see there as well. I am wondering, we had been seeing huge swings in bond yields over the past few weeks. It had been pretty wild in the day-to-day moves. It's been pretty stable over the past couple of weeks. Do you expect that to continue, regardless of any surprise? Core PC probably baked in, because people can already calculate that by backing out certain data points. But do you expect this kind of stability to continue?
It's going to be, I think, a little bit challenging. The market thinks, 2 Fed rate cuts this year. The Fed says 1. Both are they're reasonable. Both forecasts. It could easily be 1 or the other. It could be 0. Not likely to be 3. So the question for bond yields, 10-year Treasury around 4.3%. That's pretty low. With the Fed funds at 5.5, that's a huge inversion of the yield curve. I think it's difficult to get 10-year bond yields lower unless the path of rate cuts is accelerated. And I think that is still a challenge. So I don't think there's a reason to sell off a lot. I think we are stuck at these levels waiting for a surprise, a good surprise or a bad surprise on the inflation number. A good surprise could accelerate the path of rate cuts, bringing down 10-year yields closer to 4%. If inflation remains stickier, or worse, it goes up relative to recent numbers, then 10-year bond yields bring going back to 4.5%. But the point is, volatility is likely to stay relatively muted in this 4.2, 4.5% range.
Michael Kushman, thank you, sir, of Morgan Stanley. You mentioned the inverted yield curve. The yield curve, let's take the 2-year versus the 10-year, has been inverted now for so long that many people have just stopped talking about it. What's the significance of it, Lisa, when you think about that inversion? And we've been inverted, I think, for a number of years now. Is it 2?
It's in the longest period ever in history, and typically in the past, an inversion indicates some sort of recession at some point. People are saying maybe we've already had one, and it just sort of was too light and covered up by NVIDIA, so it didn't even make a dent. I don't know what to make of that, but I think Michael Cushman's point is really interesting. We are stuck at these levels waiting for a surprise because unless you get material rate cuts, it is hard to see the 10-year yield materially moving lower and inverting the curve even that much more.
2-year versus 10-year, negative 42 basis points. The third hour of Bloomberg Savannah is just around the corner. Here's the lineup for you. Elizanne Saunders of Charles Schwab, Anisha Sherman of Bernstein, Mohammed Al-Erin of Queen's College, Cambridge, and we'll speak to Torsten Slok of Apollo from New York City. Futures are positive by 1/3 of 1%. That's your good news. All the bad news for a certain president is down in Washington, D.C. This is Bloomberg.
We're operating in a very volatile environment. So JetBlue has a very large presence here in New York, and there are air traffic control challenges. And so we've had to overinvest in hiring excess crew members and building flexibility into our planning process. And so over time, we hope to wean some of those investments back as the operating environment around us stabilizes.
We made the decision early on that we were only going to invest internally on key differentiating technologies, and clearly the powertrain is the key differentiating technology. So our investment is a recurring investment with respect to the powertrain team, the battery team, which is part of it, the engine team, the electric engine team, which is part of it. And we also have a lot of non-recurring costs with the other components because we're not developing those internally. We're using the existing aerospace defense supplier base for most of the other components.
We invest a lot in the offices, that you feel home, that you can actually be at your best yourself, and people work very differently. We take a lot of input from the sports world, actually, the athlete spirit, right? Building a sports team that can perform at the best, but also talking a lot about the explorer spirit. How can we really tap into new things, continue being disruptive? We have 80 different nationalities at On. It's very important to have a diverse team because we have a very diverse landscape of customers.
Welcome to the world of decentralized finance.
With a surge in Bitcoin, you have crypto stocks also surging.
Bloomberg's covering all things crypto, the people,
This is a political attack, and we must hold our elected officials accountable.
the transactions,
Really a record-breaking moment.
Bitcoin is the exit strategy.
and the technology.
Awareness is going to grow, and these things grow the overall industry.
Crypto as an asset class is here to stay.
Bloomberg Crypto, only on Bloomberg.
I think this will probably go down in history as one of, if not the largest financial crimes ever.
I cannot imagine a scenario where $8 billion just disappears.
Bankman-Fried has pled not guilty to multiple fraud charges.
Sam was just too important in the crypto community.
When someone says, I'm going to give $1 billion in the next 2 years, like that catches everybody's attention.
As time went on, their ideas got like weirder and weirder.
I don't think he even had almost a conception at some point that it was wrong or right. I think he just had the mentality that he has to win.
This committee will not stop until we uncover the full truth behind the collapse of FTX.
Sue, Mark.
Are you in? I'm in.
I'm in.
We're in.
Will this be the last of its kind? No. This is the nature of capitalism. Get over it.
Generally speaking, the trend in inflation is lower.
I really don't think inflation is going to pick back up. I think that it's slowing. They're going to keep slowing.
Markets, trying to figure out what the Fed's going to do next, and it's pretty difficult because it's very much data dependent.
There's a lot of data between now and September. If we see inflation coming down, if we see the labor market continue to cool, they're going to go in September.
We think things should slow down. We think inflation's coming down as well, and taken together, that allows the Fed to cut.
This is Bloomberg Surveillance with Jonathan Farrow, Lisa Abramowitz, and Anne-Marie Hordern.
Well, let's get you to the weekend. 1 hour of this program left. We'll do something a little bit different. No politics for the next 60 minutes. The focus will be on the economic data. PCE, 30 minutes away. Just got a note from Citi's Andrew Holdenhorst. The slowdown sets in. This is what he has to say. Downward revisions to consumer spending, rising jobless claims, soft durable orders, and weak housing data out yesterday, in his opinion, further establish a broad-based economic slowdown. This hour is all about the data.
He is not alone, and a lot of people had been talking about this over the past few weeks, that the data has been surprising to the downside more and more frequently. Here's the question. Everyone's talking about core PCE. I want to know whether income still is expected to outstrip spending, or whether we see basically the personal deficits of individuals getting deeper.
I know you don't want to talk about the politics, but policy is important today still. Trump yesterday did bring up tariffs, as did Biden. Biden went after him and said they're going to be inflationary. And that's what these 16 economists that came out and wrote this letter about. Policies like that. If you get PCE now to the slowest level we've seen in months, slowest level this year, that will be a huge win for this economy. Yet the concern is what's on the horizon for 2025.
The focus on inflation is just increasingly feeling a little bit stale given what's developing in the labour market. That could change again, but ultimately for me, that's where things stand at the moment. If you look at jobless claims, and this was from B. Mosey and Lincoln just yesterday, initial claims dropped 6K, but the prior week was revised higher to 239, making it the highest claims print for a non-farm payroll survey week since June 2023. Are we going to plateau at these elevated levels? Will we break down to the low 200K again? Or are we going to start to incrementally start to break out? And that's the concern that lots of people have.
Especially because of the differential between the payrolls and the household survey and employment and how different it has been. There have been a lot of people who say never in history has it been a linear move where you just see unemployment tick up in a sort of gradual way. And so this raises this question, how different is this moment at a time where people are saying it is still distorted from post-pandemic realities that are very different than what we've had before? That is what is addressing people, and the reason why today's print might not move the needle when it comes to the narrative, but it's another data point on that march.
The payrolls report about a week away. That's going to be a big one, particularly after what we saw, the divergence between the last report and, to your point, establishment versus household. Equities right now on the S&P 500 going into that opening bell are positive by about 1/3 of 1% on the S&P. We'll have a big conversation about Nike a little bit later. In the pre-market, that stock is lower by anywhere between 13 to 15%. That stock, Lisa, is getting absolutely hammered this morning.
At a time when you're wondering how do you remain relevant in a world that's shifting very quickly. We talked about the running cohort and the whole idea of Hoka and On and what happens with that. It really raises this issue. Even people would say, oh, it's China, and it's the China sales. No, the China sales actually outperformed. It is Converse sales down 18%. Even their benchmark sort of Air Jordans not delivering. And it raises this question of relevancy at a time when this is a fast-moving retail and consumer market.
That stock getting hammered. Coming up this hour, we'll catch up with Liz Ann Saunders of Charles Schwab as the second quarter winds down. We'll catch up with Bernstein's Anisha Sherman as Nike stumbles on a weak earnings report. And we'll speak to Mohammed Al-Aaron of Queen's College, Cambridge, reacting to PCE inflation data dropping in about 26 minutes' time. We begin with the big issue, wrapping up Q2. Liz Ann Saunders of Charles Schwab saying this: we do see building risk of some consolidation at the index level if performance divergences persist into the second half of the year. While they don't seem imminently fatal to the bull market, we think more members will need to start joining the party for the music to stay on. Liz Ann, I'm pleased to say, is with us now. Liz Ann, I was going through some of the stats in your work. Only 17% of the S&P has outperformed the index over the last year. You pointed out the NASDAQ, that number is much worse at 11%. Can you just build that out for all of us? What do you think that indicates?
Well, I think it indicates that we really have two markets here at the index level and then under the surface. And you can see it via stats like that, percent of the index, whether it's S&P or NASDAQ outperforming. And that table that you pointed out, John, also shows 1 month, 2 month, 3 month. And you don't get much more than about 25%, no matter what time frame you're looking at. But another way to think about it is the average member maximum drawdown within these indexes. So we know the S&P is at an all-time high, NASDAQ at an all-time high. You've had no more than a 5% drawdown in the S&P, only 7% drawdown in the NASDAQ, but that's at the index level. In the case of the NASDAQ, the average member maximum drawdown just year to date is 39%. So there's a heck of a lot of turmoil and churn and rotations going on under the surface, which I do think reflects all of these uncertainties that we all talk about on a day-to-day basis. You just don't see it at the index level because of that mega cap bias.
Liz, and some of these stats you just shared with us, are they a typical feature of a typical bull market, or is there something very unique and unusual about this experience?
So what's not unique is having a relatively small handful of names really drive performance via their size. It's when the rest of the market is significantly underperforming that's where you get into historically rare sets of circumstances, and also suggests that some consolidation is probably likely. And I think that shift could happen with convergence. And in fact, I think that might be a somewhat healthy thing if we saw further pullbacks in some of those mega cap names, but at the same time, more of a clawing higher on the part of the rest of the market. Interestingly, that was what was happening in October of 2022. The indexes were taking out their prior June lows, but under the surface, you were seeing improving breadth. You were seeing more of the kind of soldiers head toward the front line. And so even though at the index level it didn't look great, that was a sign of some grinding higher on the part of the names that were just not in focus in a cap-driven market.
This is fascinating to me, Lizanne. We had earlier Julian Emmanuel of Evercore basically saying that the lack of breadth is a feature, not a bug, and that frankly, the fact that you're seeing equities up on an index level without the participation of so many shares highlights the resilience of this market and the fact that it's been powered by these names and the others can really converge to the upside. What's your argument against that?
Well, no, I don't disagree with that. In fact, I think when going back to that negative 39% maximum drawdown at the member level for the NASDAQ, that kind of weakness under the surface breeds opportunity. So when you have that poor breadth, at some point, you start to see an improvement there. And I think that's where there are opportunities that are presenting themselves. The other interesting thing about this focus on the Magnificent Seven or the, Magnificent Six or Fab Five, whatever component you want to talk about of these mega cap names, is from a contribution to index return perspective, they're all in the, call it top 10, but they're not the best performers. From a price performance perspective, only one of the Magnificent Seven is in the top 10 best performers in the S&P 500. Look at the 10 best performers in the NASDAQ year to date. None of them are household names. None of them are in the Magnificent Seven. And so I think it shows that there's a lot of churn under the surface, but that is also bred opportunity, and that there are ways to find performance. And in this environment, we continue to say you want to stay up in quality. And that may seem like the ultimate, well, duh, but there are times where you want to go down the quality spectrum. That's where the leverage is for companies that have weaker balance sheets or have lost their earnings, have that leverage to a pickup in the cycle. I don't think we're at that point. So staying up in quality, if you look just at the performance spread between profitable within the Russell 2000 and non-profitable, it's about 14 percentage points, with strong double-digit positive gains for profitable and negative on the part of non-profitable. So there are opportunities that get born out of a tough breadth environment like this. And I think that gets lost in a lot of this analysis.
I love this, Lizanne. It's sort of like you scramble the macro narrative enough that you force people to actually pay attention to what individual companies are doing. Because for so many years, the macro narrative blinded everybody to some of the single name type of analysis. What happens when the macro is not scrambled? What happens when we have a direction? How much does the whole market become vulnerable in a new way because of how high the elevation has been for some of the valuations at the top?
Well, I think recession would certainly be a macro narrative that is not priced into the market broadly. There's certainly metrics that are pointing in that direction, but a heck of a lot of economists thought that last year, and that was not the case. And that's just the unique nature of this cycle. But I think more significant deterioration, particularly in the labor market, even if it provided the Fed the green light, start easing policy. I think any backdrop that requires the Fed to have to be quick and somewhat aggressive on the downside with rates. I always say to people who want the Fed to start ASAP and move quickly, be careful what you wish for, because one of the clear distinctions that's happened in the past with regard to Fed policy and impact on the equity market at the point where they start easing policy is slow versus fast. A slow-moving Fed in the cutting part of the cycle is beneficial for the equity market for somewhat obvious reasons, in that they're probably not combating a recession or a financial crisis or some combination thereof. A Fed that has to start moving aggressively on the downside so soon after such an aggressive move on the upside, I think that would be destabilizing for the market.
Lizanne, I'm so pleased you said that. Not all rate cuts are created equally. You're just dead on. Lizanne Saunders of Charles Schwab, one of the best, and great to catch up with you as always. Lizanne, thank you. Just want to turn to the market boards briefly and start with equities and look at equity futures. And I've got a question at the end for Lisa, not for me to answer. Equity futures right now on the S&P positive by 1/3%. Some outperformance on the Russell, up by 0.8%. How many people this morning are looking at the charts from yesterday evening into this morning and looking at what futures have done and attributing it to what developed in that debate last night?
Nobody. Absolutely nobody, which I find interesting. There are no notes saying the market is rallying because the former President Trump has a likelihood of becoming president. Most people saying the markets are not responding. And the reason why is because it's too soon to understand the composition and they don't pay attention until after Labor Day. When do we start attributing this to it? I actually thought about this morning. It just shows how kind of arbitrary it can be sometimes when we assign a narrative to a market move. Sometimes it's obvious, and sometimes it's really not.
People are calling this debate, though, a disaster for the sitting president of the United States, potentially because Democrats are out in the open now discussing for months what I've heard behind the scenes, which is maybe they could not have Biden be their candidate. The DNC is in August. Maybe that's why markets are actually not selling off. Maybe they think this could be a 1968 Lyndon Johnson moment. He makes a speech and he steps aside because his performance was so bad.
The opinion section of the New York Times, a lot of people are sharing this online at the moment. I can show you some of the headlines from it. Joe Biden is a good man, good president. He must bow out of the race. Biden cannot go on like this. After the debate, I don't think Joe Biden should be running. You see these kind of headlines repeatedly this morning.
At the same time, what we've heard is it doesn't seem like it's resonating inside the Biden camp. Let's see what happens. A lot of people saying it has to happen within the next 2 weeks. That's what Libby Cantrell said of PIMCO, basically saying that is sort of the deadline, the drop-dead deadline before we can get potentially a new candidate at the top of the Democratic Party.
It's certainly going to be a long weekend for that campaign. Let's get you an update on stories elsewhere with your Bloomberg Brief. Here's Danny Berger. Hey, Danny.
Hey, John. Israel and Hezbollah are heading closer to a full-blown war in Lebanon. It's been a steady tit-for-tat between the two, and it started after Hamas attacked Israel on October 7th and has been shifting into something more alarming. Record numbers of Hezbollah projectiles have hit Israel, and Israel is carrying out deeper and more destructive attacks in Lebanon. Tens of thousands of residents have been driven from homes in both regions. A check on Apple shares this morning, up ever so slightly, less than 1%. iPhone shipments in China rose 40% in May after heavy discounts ahead of the country's June shopping festival. Shipments jumped 50% in April as Apple attempts to bounce back from weaker Chinese markets. Overall smartphone shipments, though, climbed more than 13%, but foreign brands grew almost 4 times faster. That's according to Bloomberg calculations of official data. Microsoft has told more customers that their emails may have been accessed by Russian hackers. In January, Microsoft had disclosed that senior leaders' emails were stolen, but now the company is acknowledging that the hack was more widespread. Microsoft has been dealing with strong condemnation by U.S. governments for security breaches, with the company now undergoing one of the biggest security overhauls in decades. And that's your brief, John.
Danny, thank you. More from Danny in about 30 minutes' time. Up next on the program, the morning calls on one stock. It's Nike. We'll catch up with Bernstein's Anisha Sherman as Nike stumbles on a weak earnings report. That stock is down by 15% in pre-market trading. From New York, this is Bloomberg.
Access the financial world on demand. Hear from leading economists, policymakers, and industry experts via live and on-demand.
My general advice is continue to seek out companies or people that are maybe one stage or two stage ahead of you. And I think this is generalizable to not just to startups, but anyone seeking fast growth in their own professional lives, in their careers too. What does greatness look like? Try to seek out people who've been there, done that before, and then try to not connect with one, but try to interview 3, 5, 10 people to see what is a general pattern of greatness that look like that will get you to the next level of the company, next stage, maybe a year, 12 months from now, 24 months from now. Seek out people who kind of went down the path a few times. Then you'll start to find this pattern that start to emerge. What are things that you need to have 12 months from now, 24 months from now that you currently don't have? Then try to like build a path towards that. It's almost like Amazon's or Jeff Bezos' mantra of working backwards. Think about what your end game or next stage look like, and then figure out your steps to getting there, and who do you need to work with, upgrading or coaching your existing team or recruiting from somewhere else to really level your leadership. Because ultimately, the job of a CEO is to do 3 things, right? One is get the strategy right for your company, making sure it's executed, get the right teams onboarded, getting the resources, whether it be fundraising or allocating your resources. So it's strategy, people, or team, figuring out how you need to navigate those things to get to the next level.
When I was younger, I used to be in bands. I'd play drums in bands and toured America with them, did a lot of session drumming, recorded albums. So yeah, it was good fun doing the drumming. The only reason I stopped it, well, I still play, but not as serious as I did when I was younger, but drumming doesn't pay the bills. I was never good enough to be able to pay the bills with it, but it was good fun. I started RJF, and the reason I started it was I saw a gap in the market for particular early stage and startup businesses. With the experience that I've got of running businesses, of being a finance director at the very biggest companies in the world to being finance director of small startups, we were looking at providing more than just basic accountancy services. So yes, we'll do all that, we'll do all the basic, all the statutory side of things that you need to do. But there's so much more value that we can add, and I wanted to have my experience to help these startups, because a lot of them don't really know where to go. You can go to your high street accountants and they can do a good job compliance-wise, but you would question whether they've actually been in the fire line of a business. Have you been in a business where you're thinking, how do I pay wages next week? Or business is really successful, what do we do with it next? Or how do we grow it? How do we grow into international territories? Or how do we grow our markets? How do we expand? So a lot of the experience I've seen over the years and seen different types of business in different sectors, I thought, well, it's a real value that I can add to these businesses as opposed to just being an FD, because a lot of these businesses can't afford an FD. But if we can take care of their statutory side of things, the compliance side of things, I'm on hand to be able to help and advise businesses with their growth strategy, or if they're in difficulty, help them through these times.
It's an $142 billion market cap company, which is a significant size. It's a daily move for NVIDIA. I'm looking right now at sort of the larger question, especially ahead of personal income and spending, which we get in just about 10 minutes' time. Is there a sense that Nike's pitfalls stem from a weakening and more selective consumer, or is this just a Nike problem?
I think it's a bit of both. So it's obviously a Nike problem in the sense that their new innovations have not been able to draw in as much demand and brand heat as they should have done. And now they're having to correct that by cutting some of the older franchises and reinvesting in new innovation. However, it's also in the context of macro. So this same issue didn't cause them problems in FY22 or 23, where their sales were growing, 16% in the last fiscal year before this one. So that was in the context of a macro where consumers, particularly middle and higher income consumers in the US, were in this wave of revenge spending. They had pandemic savings left over. They were going on trips. They were getting out there. And now their savings are run out. Their credit card debt is high. They're repaying student loans. Their wage growth has not kept up with inflation, and there's no revenge spending catalyst. So they are pulling back. And in the macro context of a pullback, you need to have something really new and different to draw in consumers.
So is this a win for Adidas and Lululemon? And I mentioned them because you specifically talk about them in your note.
I think they're all in different places. I think Lululemon is facing some of the same macro pressures on its consumer, which was also spending in 2022 and is now pulling back. And they need to also rethink their own innovation, particularly to attract younger consumers and to attract men, so kind of outside their core middle-aged women consumer. For Adidas, they're on the upswing. Their terrace trend is working. It's working globally. They're at the peak level of that trend. And the question is, can they sustain that trend? Can they do more to keep it going, or is it going to fade out next year? So they're in a good place right now. It's just a question of can they keep it?
When you talk about innovation, are you basically just saying they need to be cool again? Because our Bloomberg intelligence analyst basically said Nike has nothing new. There's no newness to this brand.
Yes, it's coolness, it's newness in design, it's, getting a silhouette out there that looks different, that looks exciting, that people want to buy. It's not necessarily about technical innovation. I mean, most people who run are not really concerned with what the carbon plate or the midsole foam composition is, because they're not trying to shave 30 seconds off their marathon time. They want something that's comfortable and that looks good. So it's about design, innovation, and comfort rather than, real technical prowess, which Nike already does very well.
Anisha, why haven't we seen more acquisitions? I can think of a brand like Athletic Propulsion Labs, which makes a very sleek shoe, really nice sneaker. I've had a couple of pairs over the last few years. I've always wondered why some of these big brands haven't come in and bought other brands like that. Why isn't that happening?
It's not a very acquisitive sector, and some of the acquisitions in recent years haven't gone very well. If you think about Lululemon buying Mirror or Adidas buying Reebok, some of the acquisitions have not been particularly successful. Most of the big brands believe that they have the in-house talent to create this design, and they already have the retailer relationships and the distribution footprint and the consumer awareness. So as long as they can do that design innovation in-house, that's a better way to do it. Now, it's contingent on them being able to innovate in-house, and that's the hiccup that Nike is facing right now.
That's certainly been the struggle. Anisha, it's good to hear from you. Anisha Sherman there of Bernstein, with that name down in the pre-market by 15%. Why are you both laughing at me?
Well, I immediately Google, of course, Athletic Propulsion Labs, and I start looking and figuring out which particular shoes you've had.
Is it the 320 version? Is it the $430 version? You're spending a lot of money on shoes.
I'll share them with you. It's a pastime of mine. I'm not a big drinker. I work out. I go to the gym.
Okay.
I need sneakers.
Do you do it for the technology and just the speed?
No, I love the look. I find them very sleek. They used to be distributed in Lululemon stores. Then that stopped, and they went through their own channels, I guess. You can only buy them direct from, I believe, APL now.
That's Anisha's point, is that basically people are going to buy it off the way they look and whether they're relatively comfortable. I will say, some of the running shoes that I find the best personally are not particularly attractive, and I feel incredibly anxious about it every time. Well, I'm not going to get into the Hoka debate, but the ones that I have are in particular very functionally good, but, not the most beautiful.
You care about the carbon fiber plate and all of that stuff, right? Is that what you're saying?
It's on brand, don't worry.
Okay, all right. It sounds very on brand. All right, are you done taking digs?
Well, I was just going to say that I think Nike missed one certain moment, which is actually, you see all these opinion pieces, even in the Wall Street Journal, about how athleisure wear has moved into workwear. And they could have had a moment here coming out of the pandemic with more people buying a lot of these goods and even using it if they're going to go back to the office 2 or 3 days a week, and they missed that boat.
That's something I have strong feelings about, that athleisure became workwear. But anyway, this is meant to be a serious morning.
I do as well. There should be work dress policy.
I agree. This is meant to be a serious morning. We'll be focusing on the economic data next. Breaking PCE data. Mohammed Al-Erin of Queen's College, Cambridge, joining us in just a moment. And later, Apollo's Torsten Slog. All of that and more still to come as we count you down to the opening bell, about 1 hour and 4 minutes away, with equity futures positive by 0.4%. Where has June gone? Where has Q2 gone? Where has the first half of 2024 gone? It's all behind us now. One more day to go. That day is still ahead of us with equity futures positive. This is Bloomberg.
Always on the heartbeat of the tech
spread across global markets.
The real-time data aspect is going to be important.
We're going to bring you expert analysis on that. Sure.
Don't miss Bloomberg's interview with the
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
Seconds away from economic data in the United States, I can tell you that Mohammed Al-Erin is joining us in about 2 minutes' time. No tie. I'm not sure if that's an indicator of whether this is going to be hot data, cool data. We did this around the labour market, right?
When was the last time he wore a tie? We can ask him, and then we can really decide whether or not this is deliberate or whether
He joined us
this is
payrolls Friday, did not have a tie, and the labour data came in hot. Remember?
There you go. All right, so maybe this is a sign.
We'll see. I've got no idea. Futures positive by 0.4% on the S&P, on the Nasdaq up by 0.5%. In the bond market, we look a little something like this. For Treasuries, the 2-year, 10-year, and 30-year yields a little bit lower on a 2-year by a basis point at 469. Call it 470 as that data drops. Mike McKee's with us. Morning, Mike.
Good morning. I have a tie on, and I don't know what that means, but it does mean that consumers' income comes in higher than expected, up 0.5% compared with a 0.3 rise in the month of April. Personal spending 0.2, which is a little bit lower than the forecast, but same as last month. And then the numbers everybody cares about: PCE price index flat on the month as forecast, which means the price index goes to 2.6% from 2.7%. Core is up just 0.1 as forecast, and core PCE 2.6% on a year-over-year basis. Now, what this tells you is that economists are getting very good at forecasting PCE, and the Fed can continue to look forward to lowering rates without giving us a time frame to do so.
And no bad news here, Mike, and that's good news. So this rally this morning isn't disruptive. It continues. We are positive by 0.5% on the S&P. You've got the small caps, the Russell, up by more than 0.9% now, just pulling back a little bit from those levels. In the bond market, yields were a little bit higher. Now they're a little bit lower, particularly at the front end on a 2-year by a basis point or two. We break 470 to the downside. In the FX market, Japan is grateful, I guess, 160.54 on dollar yen. Lisa, on that currency pair, we're negative by 0.1%.
You know, you said something a while ago that no surprise is basically a good surprise, at least for the bond market, and that's what you're seeing today. The one thing that might be somewhat unexpected is that personal income exceeded personal spending by such a big degree. That's going to be an increasing question. Does this mean that the consumer is actually, A, being a little bit more disciplined, and B, actually seeing their personal finances get better, not worse?
Mike nailed it, I think. With PCE, it's easy to predict once you've got CPI. Mike, and once you've got PPI, you've got all the details you need and you can come up with a decent estimate. We've now got jobless claims behind us, continuing claims behind us, going into payrolls next Friday. Have we got a decent picture of what happened in the survey week and how this might come out the other side for payrolls next Friday?
Yes, but you can't really use jobless claims the same way you can use the CPI for PCE. It suggests, the jobless claims side suggests that there's not been a lot of change in the overall labor market. And so if you think that we're still adding workers at a reasonably strong pace, then you can go ahead and extrapolate that out. Now, one of the things that we end up doing is taking the ISM hiring numbers, hiring plans numbers, to a certain extent, ADP. We won't get into that, Lisa. But you take all these other indicators and you try to plug them in and come up with something. And right now, it's early, but basically economists think that we're going to see something in the 180s range, which is what they forecast last time, and then we got an upside surprise.
How long has it been a muddle? I mean, we've been in a muddle for a while, where people basically are picking their own narrative, and you can get mad at people and say that it's just two things, which is inflation's coming down and unemployment's ticking up, but it feels a bit like a muddle. How long has it been now?
oh gosh, about 2 years.
How
And coming
unusual is
out
that?
of the pandemic, and Tom Barkin had a speech this morning, the Richmond Fed president, asking the question of why did everything go wrong, all the models go wrong, and there's a whole lot of reasons why that they can look back on, but they got it wrong, everybody got it wrong.
I guess I'm looking at this and I'm saying we're still in a muddle, and yet if you were just going to draw one conclusion from this data that is less predicted than, say, the PCE, which you say is incredibly predictable, you look at personal income outstripping personal spending. And this is an inflection point where you're starting to see that really shift after people used up some of their pandemic savings, at least according to the San Francisco Fed and some data they put out. Is that significant, that personal finances are actually getting better at this point?
Yes, and I'll give you a reason why here. This is a surprising number, and people don't forecast this. Wages and salaries were up 0.7 during the month of May, after 0.2 in April. We know from economic history, to the extent it's valid after the pandemic, people tend to spend what they make. So even though the pandemic savings has gone away, people are feeling, if their paychecks are going up, they're feeling like they can spend money, and that's what they appear to be doing. We don't know if this is the 0.7 rise is in general or sort of an outlier because we have seen wages trending down. But in this case, it's a very strong number that would suggest people can keep spending.
Manaki, stay close, stick with us. Joining us now to continue this conversation, I'm pleased to say, is Mohammed Al-Erin of Queen's College, Cambridge. Mohammed, let's talk about the totality of the data. I'm going to sound like a Fed official. When you look at the totality of the data, are you seeing concrete signs of an economic slowdown, a loss of momentum, and do you think a conversation about reducing interest rates as soon as next month is warranted?
Yes and yes, John. So if you look at the data as a whole, the economy is slowing, and it's slowing faster than most economists expect, and certainly more faster than what the Fed expects. So yes, on the whole, the economy is slowing. And let's remember, this is an economy that has very few buffers. Most of the buffers that we've had in terms of personal savings and in terms of debt capacity, they've been run down. And that leads you to the second question, which is a forward-looking Fed would certainly have the possibility of a July cut on the table.
How much daylight do you think there is between what you think they should do and what they will do?
Too much. You know, if I were them, I would seriously look at July as being a live meeting. I don't think that's the case. I think there's even a question mark in the market. And certainly, if you look at what the narrative of the last few days by Fed official as to whether even September is live. Right now, the market gives less than a 50% probability of a rate cut in September. So that narrative has been pushing back the rate increase towards the end of the year. Had one or two Fed officials would like to keep open the possibility of a hike, and I think that is a long way from where they should be based on what's happening to the economy. But unfortunately, John, they've been burnt a couple of times already. And let's not forget, they're still excessively data dependent. So it takes quite a bit of historic data to get them to change.
So I'm not going to sound like John here. Let's not talk about the totality of the data or a Fed official. Let's cherry pick. Let's talk about some very specific numbers. I want to cherry pick personal income coming in at 0.5% versus the expectation of 0.4%. That is up from 0.3% in the prior month. Mohammed, just looking at personal income and the fact that it's increasing even as personal spending declines, does that give you a sense, if we just wanted to cherry pick that number, understanding the totality of the data is different, that maybe people are actually in a better place and have a greater ammunition and set of financial tools to keep spending at a pretty robust pace?
Lisa, I'd love to be where you are, okay? But there's a problem. Even if we cherry pick, and even if we say 1 month data has a ton of information content, so these are two big assumptions, I wouldn't know if the increased savings that comes from income going more than spending, is it voluntary or is it forced? Are people voluntarily saving more, or do people feel forced to save more? So as much as I would like to go to where you are in terms of that number, I hesitate because first you have to assume away some pretty important things. But secondly, we don't know whether it's voluntary or forced.
That's a fascinating point. I'm sitting here thinking about that at a time when other people might say the reason why they're not spending is because they're not buying homes and they're not feeling like they have the capacity and the mobility to do so. One argument that some of the more inflationistas out there have made is that if the Fed were to cut rates by 25 basis points next month, that would reignite a surge of interest in the housing market, and that you could see actually prices climb much more substantially as a result. Do you believe that to be the case? And if not, why?
So I don't think 25 basis points is going to make that much of a difference to the housing market. That's the first issue. I think you need a lot more than 25 basis points. Don't forget how much we've moved the other way. That's the first point. And second, on housing, it gets even more complicated because supply has been impacted in a way that most people didn't expect. So most people thought that the demand for housing would come down as rates went up. What they didn't realize is that the supply of housing would also come down as people hesitated from going from a very low rate mortgage to a current mortgage. So, again, that market has been distorted by what happened during this long period of rock bottom rates. And we must not forget that a lot of distortions occurred. And in slower moving asset classes like housing, it takes time to get these distortions out of the system.
I'm just wondering if 25 basis points wouldn't necessarily reignite the housing market. Is there still a reverse argument that if they don't cut by 25 basis points next month, that they could be accelerating a tipping point that the U.S. labor market is already reaching?
So that's where I am. I think if you look at the tails of the distribution, or if you look at type 1 error, type 2 error, right now, the one that scares me more is that they are too slow, they are too high for too long, and that economy slows in such an extent that two things happen. First, they can't moderate the slowing, and second, they end up by having to cut rates much more than they would have otherwise, just like they ended up by hiking rates much more than they would have had otherwise because they were so late. So when I look at the tails of the distribution, and remember, I put on the table the notion that a soft landing is 50%, 35% is that we end up in recession because the Fed doesn't react quickly enough, and 15% is the bigger but not hotter, that you get a supply side, a positive supply shock, something like that. When I look at that distribution, yeah, I do worry. I do worry that the more likely error right now is that the Fed will not start cutting early enough, and then will be forced into cutting aggressively, but it's not going to have the impact in terms of slowing or moderating the slowdown, and then will overshoot on the way down yet again.
Mohammed, there's a new wrinkle. How independent is all of this from policy out of the White House in 2025?
So, John, I've been fascinated by the discussion you've had as to why are markets so calm about U.S. politics. Why are so market calm when the yen is at 160? Why are so markets calm when France, Germany, the spread is at 84 basis points? And the list goes on and on. Why are they so calm when the Middle East conflict can intensify? And I think the reason is because we here in the U.S. have three things going for us. One is a belief in economic exceptionalism, that we can soft land the economy or even no land at all. That's still actually the central scenario for a lot of people. That's number one. Two, that we ultimately believe the Fed will cut. And three, we believe that NVIDIA and the AI revolution is such a positive supply shock that it's going to keep on giving and giving and giving. You know, on the three, I worry most about the economic assumption. And that's why, if that economic assumption is tested in the months ahead, then the politics, what's happening around the world, suddenly all these things will capture much more attention in the marketplace than they have so far.
Mohammed, though, we're waking up after a moment where the sitting president had what everyone is calling a disastrous debate. Obama's former campaign manager went on MSNBC and called it DEFCON 1. Alarm bells are ringing. What would be enough between now and November, or potentially what political movement could move the markets between now and November?
So this is your world, and Marie, much more than mine. I think the market truly believes, despite what they hear from some economists, that when push comes to shove, whether it's President Biden re-elected or whether it's President Trump comes back into the White House, the degrees of freedom is not going to be as much. The degree of freedom, well, there will be, it may be on tariffs, but we've seen that both of them actually are very similar in what they end up doing. So the market, I think, senses that despite what the economists are telling them about fiscal policy, tariffs, everything else, that when push comes to shove, these two individuals, when in power, will be relatively similar in economic policies. Why? Because we've had 4 years of each, and the market has been able to observe what they've done. Now, bring in the possibility of someone new, and that suddenly changes that whole construct. So responding to your question, that's the big question, is that if you bring someone new into the equation, how will the market evaluate, and what degree of confidence will markets have? It really helps the market that they saw both individuals in the White House.
Mohammed, I just want to finish on this and get you to elaborate on a finer detail. In the UK, the gilt market has been a constraining, regulating force on all kinds of policies coming out of either party in this election race. And you can see that in the nervousness they have talking about the deficit. You're seeing a similar thing take place in France right now. Do you think this Treasury market could become a regulating force over the next administration in this country, in the United States? Or will we retain that unique privilege to do other things?
We will retain that unique privilege, John, because the rest of the world is so messy. So I think of it very simply. Whether it's France, whether it's the UK, they solve an absolute space. If there is fiscal irresponsibility, then they will feel it regardless of what's happening elsewhere. The US bond market solves in a relative space. So as long as other countries are more irresponsible than us, then we can continue being irresponsible.
Mohammed, you're one of the best. You're going to stick with us. We want some final thoughts before we go into next week. Mohammed Al-Arian there. Let's get you an update on stories elsewhere with your Bloomberg Brief. Here's Danny Berger. Hey, Danny.
Hey, John. Just a quick recap of that data we got about 15 minutes ago. It's the Fed's preferred inflation gauge, and it came in line with forecast. Core PCE deflator rose at 0.1% month over month, and that's the smallest advance in 6 months. Personal income in May rose 0.5%. That is higher than estimates, while personal spending was just a touch softer than estimated. The data likely will boost the case for cuts later this year. A check on Nike shares tumbling in the pre-market down 15.33%. Its full-year outlook fell short of expectations. The company said that revenue would decline in the mid-single digits this fiscal year. Nike has been struggling to churn out lifestyle wear with little offerings to replace prior top sellers like Air Force Ones and Dunks. Instead, rivals have picked up the slack like Adidas, who says retro Samba sneakers are fueling a new era of growth. The NFL is facing a massive antitrust lawsuit after jury sided with fans over pricey broadcast subscription costs. The league was hit with a $4.7 billion worth of damages, which stands to be tripled to $14 billion under federal law. Fans had claimed that the league conspired with DirecTV to raise the prices to watch out-of-market games. The league made the unusual decision, though, to take that suit to trial. Commissioner Roger Goodell appeared as a witness in it. A league spokesperson called the verdict disappointing and said the NFL plans to appeal. And that's your Bloomberg Brief. John.
Danny, thank you. Thanks for this morning. Have a nice weekend. Up next on the program, we'll set you up for the week ahead. You're watching Bloomberg Surveillance.
I've seen firsthand how some fashion businesses make women feel. And I think there's one thing, being really vocal and being an Instagram activist and talking about something, there's a difference than putting your money where your mouth is and really trying to do something about the problem. And that's what I did with that business. It was about how do I take everything that I know and I've learned and actually do the opposite. And I think that as a young black female entrepreneur, the only thing that I could do was what I know from my experience. And the honest truth is, I didn't set out to create a company that was like deeply rooted in the principles of inclusivity and diversity. I set out to make a company that was right for me and my friends, and I knew that if I had a problem, chances are somebody else does. And I think that's where so many businesses are, created, when you're solving a problem that's real for you and therefore real for the consumer.
It's the world's second largest economy with a growing influence in global affairs. But geopolitical uncertainties, deflationary pressures, and questions about foreign investment linger. Bloomberg, The China Show, brings you the unmatched expertise you need to keep track of breaking news, in-depth market analysis, and the most influential newsmakers in and around China. Bloomberg, The China Show. Weekdays around the world, right here on Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
DOJ or other authorities
could face bigger challenges next.
Was going to keep bringing the World Cup. This is a 3
as the economic picture.
Covering the intersections of Hollywood, Silicon Valley, and beyond.
Why do the biggest names in business choose Bloomberg?
That is a great question.
It's a great question.
Great question. Great question.
Best question I get all night.
Bloomberg, top experts, great questions.
Mohammed said it's Dress Down Friday, so I guess it's Dress Down Friday. Equity futures positive by 0.2% on the S&P 500, counting you down to the opening bell. Here's your trading diary at 10 a.m. We'll get the unmatched sentiment survey, followed by more Fed speak from Bauman and Daly at noon Eastern. On Sunday, it's the first round of French elections. Monday, ISM manufacturing numbers. Tuesday, JOLTS data plus Fed Chair Jay Powell speaking from the ECB Forum in Sintra, Portugal. Wednesday, another round of jobless claims into Thursday. US markets, of course, closed for the 4th of July holiday, plus the UK holding its first national election in 5 years. And finally, if you get through all of that, you've got the payrolls report on Friday. For a final word, joining us now, Apollo's Torsten Slok together with Mohammed Al-Arian. Fantastic to have the two of you with us. Mohammed's really laid out a different kind of story, Torsten, to the one that you've been pushing over the last couple of weeks. Let me just begin with what you thought of what Mohammed had to say in the last 15 minutes.
Well, I mean, as we talk about every day, I mean, there's a lot of things going on in different data points, but I do think that the incoming data, in particular the more important data, it still shows the economy doing well. Non-farm payrolls at 272,000 was good. Now the consensus expects 185 for next Friday. That's not bad either. We have the Atlanta Fed GDP now expecting GDP growth in the second quarter of 2.7. That's not bad either. Jobless claims are moving exactly in line with the seasonal patterns that we normally see. And finally, if you look even at the weekly Red Book same-store retail sales, is also chugging along very nicely, together with car sales, which should have been down, but is also still doing very nicely. So it's a little bit difficult at this point to see, and I think Mohammed agrees with this, we're not seeing the economy fall apart. It is just the case that a lot of the incoming data just still continues to point to an economy that has two tailwinds from easy fiscal conditions, meaning we still have support from the CHIPS Act, the Inflation Act, and Infrastructure Act, and we also still have easy financial conditions providing a tailwind. So overall, we still see steady growth for the next several quarters.
So I can't handle all of the people who are so casual, everyone laying their hair down on this Friday. Before we get back to you, Mohammed, let's get to you, Torsten, on the point that Mohammed was making, that the balance of risks right now is more seriously tilted to the Fed making an error by not cutting quickly enough because of weakness that you're seeing in the labor market and because of a real concern that you're seeing among the average household.
Yeah, so there's certainly some distributional issues. Those who owe money, meaning those who have a lot of leverage in the household sector, those who have a lot of debt, they generally have been hit harder by interest rates going up. That generally tends to be lower income households. Higher income households have, on the other hand, been benefiting from stock prices going up, home prices going up. The cash flow from fixed income has not been better in decades than it is at the moment. That's why in the Fed distributional accounts, for the 80 to 99 percentile of the income distribution, you're actually beginning to see cash balances go up in the last several quarters. So high-income households are still providing quite a nice tailwind overall to consumer spending. But you're right, Lisa, there are some distributional aspects, but overall, when you look at the outlook for consumer spending, including the data we just got this morning, income is still very strong, and you also have on top of that, low unemployment rate of 4%. It's just that's very difficult to see that slowdown that the Fed is anticipating.
Mohammed, what would you tell someone like Torsten Slok, who thinks that right now the Fed is not going to cut rates, that there still is enough momentum to keep this economy going?
So I think the Fed is not going to cut rates till it's too late. Just to be clear, I think it should be cutting rates earlier, but I don't think it will. Look, I think that there are fundamental differences in the following areas. One, is it distributional weakening, the K economy, or is it general weakening? That's issue number one. Issue number two is Are the forward-looking indicators telling you the same thing as the backward-looking indicators? And the answer is no. The forward-looking indicators are weakening, whereas the backward-looking indicators are still relatively strong. Not as strong as they were, but relatively strong. And then third, something that you've heard me say over and over again, that I wish macroeconomists would do more often: listen to the company's earnings call. Listen to them. Walgreens. I mean, I can go through the whole list. They're all seeing weakness. They're all responding to weakness that they're seeing in the pipeline. So I understand the data is ambiguous, but I think that ambiguity goes away if A, you distinguish between forward-looking and backward-looking, and B, you inform yourself by what sort of the bottom-up is telling you, as well as the top-down.
Mohammed, do you know the excuse we're hearing about Walgreens is that it's idiosyncratic? They're dealing with problems around theft. The store experience isn't what it used to be years ago. What would you say to the people using that word repeatedly, idiosyncratic, on a range of companies at the moment?
I say you're using it too much. You're using it on a range of companies. You just answered the question. They're using it so often that you asked the question. John, I remember this in 2021. When the companies were telling us there are price pressures, we feel confident passing them on to the consumers, we're going to be raising prices, and you would hear, oh, it's isolated, okay? And people didn't listen. And by the time that played out in the macro numbers, it caught most people off guard. I'm just saying, these are tails, John. It's really important to remember, you're talking about the tails of the distribution. And you're talking about how is the balance in the tails of the distribution.
Torsten, how would you explain the distinction between what you see in the survey data, the soft data, and what you see in the hard data right now?
Well, I do think, I mean, as Mohammed is saying, on the earnings side, it has certainly been the case that some companies have been warning more to the downside. There's also several companies, airlines, hotels, restaurants, sporting events, concerts, where you're still seeing relatively strong business. Even Broadway shows is still the weekly data showing quite significant strength. So I think that what's really important in this discussion is that the Fed, they have, in my view, actually moved a little bit away from being data dependent to really more being star dependent. That there is this incredible desire to lower interest rates, the sooner the better, even though the incoming data is actually still quite strong. How can you start talking about lowering interest rates when non-farm payrolls is 272,000 and the unemployment rate is only at 4%? I know it's gone up a bit, but all this still suggests that is there really a reason to start talking about cutting rates soon when the incoming data actually and the data dependency now is less relevant when the data is actually still coming in quite good?
At least we can all agree on one thing. It's no tie Friday. Torsten Slok, Mohammed El-Erian for the both of you.
John, put your Jets tie back on, please.
I'll hold it up in the air for you, Mohammed. I'll put it on later when I leave the office, all right? Just for you. Bit of Jets to go into the weekend. Mohammed, Torsten, thank you. Coming up on Monday, Marvin Lowe of State Street, JP Morgan's David Kelly, Cameron Dawson of New Edge, Steve Rasciuto of Mizuho. You all have a wonderful weekend.
You too. You look so relaxed. Who is this person?
I'm so chill. Everyone knows. I'm like the most chill guy in New York.
You were just exuding chill.
So chill.
Oh my goodness.
So relaxed. Not intense at all. No. What are you laughing for? What's funny about that?
I like the snow tie,
Come on.
John.
There you go. Good.
Welcome to the world of decentralized finance.
With a surge in Bitcoin, you have crypto stocks also surging.
Bloomberg's covering all things crypto, the people,
This is a political attack, and we must hold our elected officials accountable.
the transactions,
Really a record-breaking moment.
Bitcoin is the exit strategy.
and the technology.
Awareness is going to grow, and these things grow the overall industry.
Crypto as an asset class is here to stay.
Bloomberg Crypto, only on Bloomberg.
You look at the number of women that want to learn the game, young girls that are joining on the tee. Really an exciting time for all of us to really capitalize on this moment. When you look at women who are making most of the purchasing decisions in households, whether that's cars or that is home or financial services, and who are going to drive the wealth of the future, it's women.
Obviously, we have our car business and we need to have games here and all that sort of thing. But what else can we do? How do we grow the platform? The whole ticket pricing process. It used to be very yellow sheet of paper, maybe some numbers around it. There was not a lot of science behind it. We're now in the world and have been for many years, as most other similar businesses are, to dynamic pricing. So our pricing for a seat may change hourly if we see demand for that, all driven to maximize revenues.
The balance sheet is so important to the success of the team. And a big part of my role is to make sure that the balance sheet stays strong and that we are prudent stewards of capital. There are things that we can do that are irrespective of winning or losing. Take a look at the first budget that comes from one of the teams and ask questions about, do you really need to spend that much? Are you really shooting high enough when it comes to partnership revenue?
Today's CFOs are reshaping the C-suite. Bloomberg's chief future officer shines a spotlight on these dynamic leaders.
It's an incredibly fun job, for sure.
We're in the business of leading beyond the numbers.
To me, teamwork is key.
You need to identify opportunities and push people.
It's not about how to say no, it's about how to say yes.
Their impact goes far beyond the balance sheet. And on Chief Future Officer, they focus on much more than just revenues and margins.
Today's CFO has to be much, much more than a bookkeeper. I talk more about culture today than I talk about numbers.
It's not just about debits and credits and digits and dollar signs.
It's a lot more than the profit today. It's building the future of tomorrow.
Get passion, perspective, and more from the Chief Future Officers of some of the world's most influential companies. New episodes this summer, only on Bloomberg. Brought to you by Workday.
From New York City, for our viewers worldwide, I'm Katie Greifeld. Futures higher right now with traders focus on the data rather than the debate. The countdown to the open starts right now. Coming up, President Biden's debate performance creating more questions than answers about the future of the election. Futures, though, on the rise as the latest PCE data shows slowing inflation, supporting the case for a rate cut, and Nike heading for its worst drop in 4 years after missing Wall Street's expectations. We begin with the big issue, the latest inflation data supporting the case for lower rates this year.
On the whole, the economy is slowing. And let's remember, this is an economy that has very few buffers. Most of the buffers that we've had in terms of personal savings and in terms of debt capacity, they've been run down. And that leads you to the second question, which is a forward-looking Fed would certainly have the possibility of a July cut on the table.
Joining us now, I'm thrilled to say we have Steve Whiting. He is Citi Global Wealth person.
Thank you.
So it's always a delicate dance one has to do when the big topic of conversation isn't what's driving markets, and I'm, of course, talking about politics. So let's just start right there, because I have this stat that the S&P 500, it's risen in 13 of the past 15 election years and posted double-digit annualized returns in both the Trump and the Biden administration. So is there any reason to think that this go-around would be different?
Well, that's the real thing. Regardless of who was in office, I mean, under Trump, there were 16% returns. Under Biden, 12% returns. Well, why? The economy was in recession 2 months out of the last 8 years. In reality, again, we have a tech-centered growing economy, and that's been the case, under either. All years since World War II, 74% of years have had positive returns for U.S. stocks. And the economy has only had about 15% of all months in recession. I mean, that's what's really critical here. Is there going to be something on the policy front that's going to drive a turning point for the economy? It will matter for certain industries. It's going to matter for foreign policy in countries, but it is not critical to the direction of the economy. If it is, we've got a problem.
So it sounds like what you're saying is there's not necessarily a Trump trade or a Biden trade to put on here, that you would look past that.
Ones that are not discounted by markets in advance. Now, that's careful. There'll be some reaction. Let's just remember that every election around the world this year has generated some sort of surprise, whether it's India or Mexico or France. Again, the composition of Congress. This is not something that we're going to ignore all the rest of what we have now to speculate on the composition of Congress post-November.
And we did get some data this morning, of course, at 8:30, not too long ago. So let's get to that PCE print just out right now. We're going to go to Michael McKee. He is Bloomberg Chief Economist and Policy Correspondent. What did we learn at 8:30?
Well, we learned things are getting better. I mean, it was a good news report for the Fed, for consumers, for the folks at 1600 Pennsylvania Avenue. Kind of won't overwhelm last night, but inflation is going down, spending's hanging in there, and Americans are making a lot more money. That's the bottom line. The headline PCE number comes in flat, and the PCE core comes in up just a tenth. Now, if you look at those, and Steve was asking me before we came on here what the unrounded numbers were, the headline unrounded number was negative, 0.01 negative, and the headline core was 0.08. So we definitely had inflation kind of disappear during the month of May. Spending up 0.2, incomes up 0.5, and here's the interesting thing: 0.7 of that was of the wage component was up 0.7 on the month, the strongest in several months, and it shows that wage pressures might still be out there, but they don't seem to be hitting inflation yet, and we know from experience that people spend what they have. Now, if you don't have the ECAN function on Bloomberg, call Katie on her personal cell phone at 8 o'clock on Saturday night. She'll get it for you. But take a look at what the breakdown is here in terms of the where the impacts were, and you see that basically it was in the services area. We're still seeing inflation only up 0.1% during the month. Goods, which are the purple thing there, they're still deflating. They're going down in price. They were down by 0.1%. And we're looking at energy and other aspects of it making up the difference, but it basically shows broad drop in the overall inflation pressures. And then we want to talk about, again, the wages thing. And I have a chart here that basically shows the difference between wages and inflation this month. Go all the way over to the right. You can barely see inflation, and look at the bar for wages. Maybe too late for Joe Biden. The political analysts can debate that, but certainly the case that people are doing better versus inflation is made by this PCE report. At least they were in May. Put it that way, Katie.
Yeah, it's definitely a difficult message to communicate to voters, which we did see last night. Michael McKee, thank you so much. And let's turn back to Steve now. So the unrounded PCE number, is that how specific we need to be right now?
Well, it's just this worry that if, we were, 0.16 instead of 0.14, you have a whole different story here. I mean, the reality is that this is sample-based economic data. There's a great deal of subjectivity to these different inflation measures, which can tell different stories. The reality is we're down from the 7% average inflation rate of the last 2 years. And if you want to know why people are unhappy, well, they're not getting their old purchasing power back. We're not deflating price levels back to where we were pre-pandemic, and that was never a reasonable prospect. Central banks have never done that. So even if inflation is rising much less, there's still a concern about what you can afford. And that's not going to go away quickly. This is the sort of thing that, you remember older people will tell you about the days when inflation galloped higher. They're not thinking about the disinflation that came afterwards. But still, overall, we're in a good performance for the economy globally. Supply and demand are meeting at more stable price levels. I do think, and I was listening to the earlier debate, that monetary policy on a forward-looking basis is going to restrain the economy. It's particularly the growth rate of employment that the Federal Reserve will turn to. The last couple of years, raging strong gains in employment. We've now lost 4 million unfilled job openings. The pace of employment compared to the initial recovery, as it should be expected, less than half the employment pace. So going forward, is tight monetary policy and this inflation rate really the right combination? I think, again, ideally, the Federal Reserve would back off of this and not take risks to the downside with the economy, protect the recovery.
Protect the recovery there. And I mean, where does that leave you when you take that conversation to the markets? Because right now, I mean, over the past several years, it seems like the playbook has just been technology. Avoid the smaller areas of the market and you'll probably be okay. Does that change?
Well, look, I mean, how good we can do when a single stock drives 30% of the market gain and it's risen ninefold in 18 months, you might just say, well, there's a lot of good news on AI. I think that could plausibly continue, but you can't quite tell when that's a little bit overpriced. you can't quite be sure. You know, are you looking back at a Cisco Systems, or are you looking back at an Apple at circa 1999, you know, that is going to go up or down over the long term? You can't know these things perfectly in advance. Innovation is very, very difficult to predict whether certain companies will be able to capitalize on their innovation or will face intense competition or emerging competition. So it's really not about cutting your exposure or all exposure by any means. What it's really about is just controlling your exposure and then thinking about the fact that we have like enormous opportunities for smaller growing companies that are not indebted, that are trading below their long-term average valuation. Or thinking about the bond market where the yield environment, I mean, in many cases, these coupons are 10 times higher than they were in 2020.
Right. Well, let's talk a little bit about some of the underappreciated areas of the market that you might be looking to right now, those smaller companies with big growth potential. So those exist out there. It also seems like you could definitely fall into a lot of value traps right now. How are you making that decision? What does the due diligence process look like?
So for us, and this is not terribly easy in terms of asset allocation, it brings us somewhat closer to an active management style, where we're overweighting thematic opportunities. Like I said, instead of buying the Russell 2000, has indebted companies, has some submerging companies, looking at mid-cap growth companies that are less leveraged. That is one opportunity. The other is, again, thematically by industry. You know, we've been overweight cybersecurity companies, for example. We think that there's a powerful spending trend long term, but there's also more intense competition of late, so we've backed off of that. We think that's parts of the healthcare sector, you know, have been steamrolled by GLP-1 drugs, right? So there are areas of the healthcare sector that have really strong, enduring defensive growth characteristics that have underperformed by a record amount. So these are things that we're doing thematically. Now, again, to avoid the value traps, we would probably throw less at just a regional market, right? Small caps in Europe, we're just, you know, not adding a lot to regions.
Small caps in Europe. I haven't heard anyone recommend that, I have to say.
Well, like I said, it's not an area, it's an area we're underweight.
Yeah, and I want to focus in on one thing you mentioned, and that's leverage, because it feels like you really have to take a microscope to this market to find the effect of higher rates. We've just barreled to these new record highs on the benchmarks. But when it comes to those heavily indebted companies, it sounds like that's definitely a cross-sector, something you would want to avoid right now.
Well, look, in some cases, it's priced quite differently across market segments. In the high-yield bond market, credit spreads are tight. In the high-yield loan market, credit spreads are wide, historically wide. In fact, in the loan market, the levels of interest rates, 9.7% as a sort of just gross nominal yield, is the highest since the global financial crisis. And if you take a look at the fact that the U.S. Treasury yield curve is inverted, we have this deep expectation of policy easing by the Fed, tight credit spreads throughout the corporate bond market. One thing that seems to be there is the expectation that adjustable rate fixed income securities will have a big cut in their yield, right? So it's left us an opportunity, I think, within this segment. It's the reason why we just raised to a small position in the highest risk component of our bond portfolios. We've added loans.
And let's end on the fixed income market specifically, because it's a simple question, but it's one of the most enduring. And I mean, you just walked through the different opportunities that you're seeing right now, but why do anything but cash at 5%? No credit risk, no duration risk. It seems like a slam dunk.
Well, again, we're not arguing that you should take long duration risk, right? And just say there's going to be even more Fed easing than is priced in. Now, that's a possibility, and you'll know it if you're a long bond investor and that happens. But the key issue here is that the Fed expects its long-run policy rate to be 2.8%. It expects its policy rate to be 3.1% in a little over 2 years, right? And so you can lock in yield now, build a portfolio in excess of 6% yield with a 4 to 5 year duration. If you take, again, you have treasuries as a big component, you have high-grade securities as a big component, and you take a couple of additional steps in your bond portfolio. That way you can have these kinds of yields in cash for much longer than the Fed is likely to be there.
Well, Steve, it's always great to see you. Really appreciate you taking the time on a Friday morning. Our thanks, of course, to Steve Whiting of Citi Global Wealth. And joining us now with a look at the stocks moving ahead of the opening bell, let's get to Abigail Doolittle.
Well, the one stock that everybody's truly watching, Katie, the shares of Nike absolutely plunging, heading to the worst day in years, the current decline of 15.7%. Well, that is worse than the sell-offs that we saw in March of 2020. They, of course, missed sales by about 2% in the quarter that was. For the fiscal first quarter, this current quarter, the sales view is light. Their casual and lifestyle segment was an issue before, needing a new product refresh to compete with some of the other running shoes. In addition, Raymond James, JP Morgan, Stifel, UBS, Morgan Stanley all cut this stock from the equivalent of a buy to a neutral, really a show me story. As for some other stocks moving on the day, the shares of Trump Media on that debate debacle for President Biden, well, they are up about 10%, up 11% at this point, up 40% into the debate yesterday, heading to the best week since late March. Morgan Stanley higher by about 0.8% after PCE, even after yields down. We have some of the banks higher. And then finally, Apple up about 0.8%. We put out a story earlier today, Katie, as you know, that the China iPhone shipments popped by 40% following solid discounts. That stock now really stuck in an interesting place before it potentially breaks out in a big way or falls right back down into the range.
Yeah, we'll have to see how that one shakes out. Abigail, thank you. Now coming up, Biden and Trump trade barbs in the first presidential debate.
We're working to bring down the price of around the kitchen table, and that's what we're going to get done.
He inherited almost no inflation, and it stayed that way for 14 months, and then it blew up under his leadership.
More on the fallout from last night's debate next. This is Bloomberg.
We invest in, buy, and own the backbone of the global economy. When the water gets delivered to your house, the road you drive on, the pipeline that brings different things to your community, the telecom towers that transmit your phone, the data center, the real estate that you live in. It's what we own and build, so it's really what drives the economy, and you don't often see our name.
Is that a good or a bad thing?
You know, it's just because we're behind the scenes, but it's big with $1 trillion of assets almost. We're behind a lot of the things of the global economy.
So being low-key, do you think it gives you strength?
We just try to be quiet and do our thing, and sometimes it helps and sometimes it doesn't. But I'd say on balance, it's been good for us.
This is Bloomberg.
DOJ or other authorities.
Could face bigger challenges next.
It was going to keep rain World Cup. This is a 3.
As the economic picture.
Covering the intersections of Hollywood, Silicon Valley, and beyond.
We brought down the price of prescription drugs, which is a major issue for many people. We're working to bring down the price of around the kitchen table, and that's what we're going to get done.
He has not done a good job. He's done a poor job, and inflation's killing our country. It is absolutely killing us. He inherited almost no inflation, and it stayed that way for 14 months, and then it blew up under his leadership.
Well, round one is over. President Joe Biden and Republican challenger Donald Trump squaring off in the first presidential debate in Atlanta. Now, that performance from President Biden raising questions about the future of his campaign. Joining us now is Bloomberg's David Gura, joining us from the ground in Atlanta. It's the morning after. We're not talking about substance. We're talking about age. And the consensus seems to be that President Biden showed his age last night.
Yeah, we'll see if there's going to be a round two. I think there's many days before we get to that point. That next debate's scheduled to take place in September. But you're right. I mean, we were looking for sort of flashes of substance over the course of that hour-and-a-half long debate, but almost immediately it was clear that style was going to rule the day. From the get-go, Joe Biden came onto the stage, mumbling, dealing with a sore throat or a cold, according to his campaign, and just looked completely mismatched with his opponent, the former president of the United States. And we heard just a moment ago some of the conversation on inflation and the economy. Obviously, some untruths there in what the former president said, but over and over again, faced with that, President Biden didn't fight back, didn't fact-check him in real time. So I think it was a surprise to many of us watching for many reasons, one of which was we know that the president spent several days at Camp David in isolation with his policy advisors, preparing for this debate, going over policy papers and all of these points, and presumably preparing retorts, ways that he could get under the former president's skin, and none of that really was on display, Katie, during the course of that debate.
And I mean, you can see the betting markets obviously moving quite dramatically in the aftermath. I mean, what has the messaging from the administration been in the aftermath of last night?
Publicly, it's been that this is fine. He had an off night. As I said, they're saying that he had a cold, and after this debate, he went to a Waffle House in Atlanta, got an early breakfast before he took a flight to Raleigh, North Carolina. Seemed a bit better, actually, in that forum than he did on the debate stage. But I'm not sure that that's going to provide much comfort to skeptics or those who are whispering about his capacity to serve a second term, that a cold could take him out in this way, and he would be rendered so unable to perform on the same level as Donald Trump on that debate stage. But the White House is putting forward a very positive spin on all of this they're trying to do. But there was a kind of interesting moment on the heels of this debate. The media watched it in a basketball arena at Georgia Tech. We were seated around the concourse, and then afterward, we went to the floor of that arena, and surrogates for both of the candidates were supposed to come out and spin the debate in the best way possible. Well, there were a ton of surrogates for Donald Trump who came out almost immediately from each entrance, it seemed like, to that arena. It took about 10 or 15 minutes, Katie, before we got two surrogates for Joe Biden. We had Governor Gavin Newsom of California and Senator Raphael Warnock of Georgia, who finally came out, kind of stood near each other and were surrounded by reporters. But one got the sense that they were spending those 10 or 15 minutes trying to figure out what, if in any way, they could spend this positively.
Well, give us a sense of the atmosphere on the ground. I mean, how did the temperature in the room change from before the debate to after the debate?
So as I said, I was sitting watching it on the Jumbotron in this arena, and the debate got underway, and there was kind of even a halting greeting by Joe Biden at the beginning of this, and a lot of us looked up kind of out of surprise. They didn't shake hands, obviously, but it was evident early on that this was not a strong performance by the incumbent president. And then after it ended, there was this kind of period of quiet before people made their way down to the floor, and then you had to listen to what these surrogates were saying. Yes, on the Republican side, then on the Democratic side, and then they were pumping cable news into the arena, so you could hear sort of how the pundits on CNN chiefly were discussing this. And I think what's interesting is you saw a lot of establishment Democrats who were talking about Joe Biden's fitness for office and this concern unabashedly in a way that they hadn't before. So this kind of opened the door to that, and I think that was what was immediately evident to me, is how the conversation changed almost immediately, that what were whispers became much louder after the course of this debate.
And of course, we're spending a lot of time talking about President Biden's performance. Of course, that is the focus of most of the conversations this morning. But how was Donald Trump's performance on its own?
I mean, he seemed confident. We were talking yesterday, you and I, just about the weirdness of this format. There wasn't going to be an audience. How was Donald Trump chiefly going to do, not having that audience to feed off of? And it was actually quite surprising to me how well he did in that format. Of course, each candidate had 2 minutes to respond to questions, and there were many moments when Joe Biden would exceed that and his microphone would be muted. That didn't happen with Donald Trump, and he had a seemingly greater control of the format. He wouldn't always answer the question. There were a lot of lies and mistruths, but he very effectively used that time, I think probably to the frustration of those who wanted more substance. He had things that he was hitting on. But going back to what I said at the top, just about preparing for this presentation, Donald Trump clearly had 3 or 4 things he really wanted to hit on, chief among them the economy, immigration, fear about crime. He kept coming back to those things and getting them into this conversation. Again, not necessarily answering the questions that were posed by the moderators, but making it very clear that these were sort of central tenets of the platform that he has as he runs for president for a second term.
And David, I know you haven't slept, so I'll let you go, but in just 20 seconds or so, is there going to be a second debate?
I think that's a very open question. I think these next 48, 72 hours are going to be really pivotal. That debate's scheduled to be on September the 10th, so we have 2 conventions before then, and I think the shroud of uncertainty is now being cast over that Democratic convention. What's going to happen there? What's going to happen in the run-up to that? I don't think anybody is feeling very confident betting that we'll see that second debate in September, although it is on the calendar.
All right, David Gura, great reporting. David Gura, of course, is the host of the Bloomberg Big Take podcast, joining us live from Atlanta. Now, coming up next, the morning calls, and later, HSBC's head of equity strategy Americas on why she's expecting more volatility in the second half of the year. This is Bloomberg.
Middle East and Africa, vibrant resources and high-yield investment opportunities abound. Join me on Horizons Middle East and Africa for the stories, newsmakers, and insight from this exciting region. Now weekdays, only on Bloomberg.
Bloomberg covers the world with unmatched reach and resources. From more than 120 countries, the moment news breaks, 24 hours a day. Bloomberg, context changes everything.
It's time now for our morning calls. A look at some of the analyst recommendations on Wall Street this morning. And first up, UBS cutting Nike to neutral after the company's outlook fell short of expectations. The analyst there writing that Nike's fundamentals are, quote, much worse than we realized. Now, that UBS call follows a number of analysts downgrading Nike and shares absolutely plunging pre-market. Next up, Seaport Global raising its recommendation on International Paper to a buy. The firm sees positive trends after the Brazilian company Suzano said it would end its pursuit of the U.S. paper giant. And finally, we do have Raymond James initiating Deere as an outperform. The firm says it's bullish on the ag equipment company, citing its leadership position and technology investment. And those, of course, are some of our morning calls. Let's take a look at markets right now, just moments away from the start of U.S. trading on the last day of the first half of the year. You can see S&P 500 futures a little bit higher right now, about 0.1%. You take a look at big tech, that NASDAQ 100, a little bit higher than that, up about 0.2%. And small caps actually are your big leader today. You can see the Russell 2000 up about 0.9% in the pre-market. Of course, we've got some good news on the inflation front this morning. Now coming up, Nicole Inouye. She is HSBC Head of Equity Strategy Americas. She will be joining us for the second half of the year outlook. This is Bloomberg.
Arch has laid plenty of groundwork for future revenue, but for now, Mark Messler's most pressing challenge as CFO is conserving capital.
You have to have the short-term discipline to sort of circle the wagons around cash. I mean, cash is oxygen. I know where every ounce of cash is going, and but we also have to be nimble around that as well because things change by the day.
Archer went public in 2021 in a reverse merger with a SPAC, Ken Moelis's Atlas Crest Investments. Through August 2023, the company raised over $1 billion from investors, including Stellantis, Boeing, United Airlines, and Cathie Wood's ARK Investment Management.
Does that ARK investment open doors for you to bring in different kinds of institutional money going forward?
It does. I mean, I think there's a lot of credibility that comes in with an investor like ARK. As I think about, my top targeted list of investors over the next 2 to 3 years, an investment like that gives us some credibility and gives us a little bit of staying power as I go in and talk to other investors.
With the SPAC pipe now closed, Archer's facing a new phase of raising capital.
I know the folks who aren't willing to invest right now may have large pockets of investment in the future. So I want to be in front of them. I'm wanting to show them progress. I want to create credibility with them that we are marching towards our goals of commercialization.
In a multi-trillion-dollar industry, there's a lot of ground to cover.
Bitcoin ETFs rubbing elbows with the big dogs.
This frenzy has engulfed the entire world.
We'll show you what's happening in ETFs like no one else. Bloomberg ETF IQ, only on Bloomberg.
This is the countdown to the open. I'm Katie Greifeld. We are moments away from the start of trading, and you take a look at the stock market right now as the bell rings. You can see the S&P 500 looking at slight gains here. Same too if you take a look at big tech, but it's the small caps that are having their moment in the sun. The Russell 2000 currently up about 0.8%. Let's also take a look at the cross-asset picture as well. You're seeing a little bit of euro weakness right now. That euro-USD pair, of course, hanging out around 106, 107 thereabouts. Take a look at the bond market, though. You are seeing a rally after those PCE numbers this morning. That 10-year yield, it's only down about 2 basis points, but it was higher going into the print, so a bit of a reversal there. And crude as well, having a little bit of a rally right now, up about 0.2%. Let's go back to the stock market, though, because one stock to watch at the open, of course, is Nike. It's heading for its worst drop in 4 years after sales missed expectations. Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle joins us now with more.
Well, the selling has increased to such a degree, Katie. We're now looking at the worst day for Nike since 2001, down about 17%. Moments ago, down closer to 19%. And this, of course, as that guidance for the full fiscal year, disappointing investors. Folks had been expecting growth of about 2%. Now they're saying it's going to be a mid-single-digit decline. So depending where that shakes out, that could almost be a 10% miss in terms of sales on not small numbers. It's really pretty significant. On the quarter that was, we saw a preview of this with the company missing sales by about 2%. Their lifestyle brand, Converse, disappointing. But of course, it's the iconic running sneakers. Lots of competition coming from the likes of Adidas, Hoka, and others. Investors and analysts really wanting to see what product can they put up. There's been some hope around Paris Olympics. Not a lot of talk about that at this point. More talk about the idea that this turnaround story is going to take a long time. To that point, we now have the stock down more than 50% from its 2021 pandemic peak, and relative to analysts, Raymond James, JP Morgan, Stifel, UBS, Morgan Stanley, there may be others, all cutting the stock from the equivalent of a buy to a neutral. Nike now clearly a show-me story, and again, the worst day since 2001.
Yeah, and a really tough reaction from Wall Street, to your point. Abigail Doolittle, thank you for that. Let's get to some good news. We have Apple higher a little bit after iPhone shipments in China rose 40%. Bloomberg Technology co-host Ed Ludlow joins us now with more. And this, of course, is one of the big worries that's been weighing on Apple this year.
Yeah, it's a continuation of an interesting recovery. So Bloomberg's kind of done the math using official data out of China, which is issued by the Academy of Information and Communications Technology. It's a 40% year-on-year gain in iPhone shipments in the month of May. We had a 50% year-on-year gain in the prior month, so a slight month-on-month deceleration. The point is that Apple had a really tough first quarter, January through March, where sales not only kind of were down, but you saw domestic handset makers gain market share. Then we entered kind of a heavy period of discounting. And that June sales season seems to be going well for Apple as it stands. There are a number of sort of onshore e-commerce events and domestic discounting events. So it's showing some stabilization. I find the stock really interesting as well. We're up 0.8%, a fifth straight day of gains. That's the best run since an 8-day winning streak ended on June 8th. And it's amazing how quickly the narrative changes. I think Microsoft's down modestly, a few tenths of a percent. But, you know, before you know it, Apple might be the world's most valuable company again. And now that the AI story is playing out and you think about valuation, where Apple trades in terms of price to earnings, people are starting to sort of pay notice again. So whether the recovery continues, this is just 1 month's worth of data, but it is a continuation of a trend we've seen, at least going back to last month, where the Chinese market is starting to improve for them.
Yeah, I mean, you're right, Ed. Slowly but surely, Apple has been stringing together these gains, currently up about 12% for the year. It wasn't too long ago it was negative for 2024, so I'm sure you'll continue to follow that one closely. That, of course, is Ed Ludlow. Let's turn now to Webtoon. It's climbing after the online comics company made its U.S. IPO yesterday. Joining us now with more is Bloomberg's Natalia Konijevic.
Katie, so the stock is up by 7%. It gained 9% yesterday. The company raised $300 million. It sold 15 million shares, and it brings its market value to about $3 billion. The company is saying that it plans to use those proceeds to expand business globally, but we have to say that this company is already considered to be one of the most successful cultural exports from South Korea. Basically, Webtoon, it's a digital comic platform. It has thousands of stories across different themes like romance, comedy, etc. And they are sliced into small episodes, and users typically read them on their smartphones. It has a pretty wide network of users. It connects 24 million of creators with about 170 million of users. And Katie, the average age is under 25 years old, so it's a pretty big network of users, but it's a pretty narrow at the same time age category, so this definitely not us.
And even still, I mean, a warm embrace by Wall Street, shares up about 11%. Bloomberg's Natalia Konijevic, thank you so much. And we've gone about 10 minutes without talking about politics, so let's get back there now, because shares of Trump Media, they're jumping following the former president's debate performance last night. And let's get to Bloomberg's Simone Foxman with more.
Yeah, Katie, it's actually been a pretty wild trading session so far for shares of Trump Media. They were up as much as 9% in the pre-market. Then they fell to about 2%. We're now looking at gains of about 3%. All of this, of course, on the back of Biden's rather stumbling performance in the debate last night. I would say that Trump himself cited some inaccuracies, made some exaggerations, but looked far more vigorous than his opponent in that debate. And of course, we've seen those calls proliferating for Biden to step aside across even left-leaning commentators. I will say the swing is not particularly strange for Trump Media. Shares, for what it's worth, were up about 20% on Monday, even despite the SEC approving last week of investors in warrants, allowing them to swap them for shares, something that could dilute investors. But on this, Trump theme and enthusiasm for all things Trump, I should note that WiseSoft, a Chinese company in trading there, its name sounds like Trump wins big to Mandarin speakers, and shares were up 10%. So no surprise that we're seeing Trump Media rally as well.
Yeah, there you go, up about 4% when it comes to DJT. Simone Foxman, thank you so much. And let's turn back to the markets right now, the broader equity markets, and what the second half of the year holds, because joining us now we have Nicole Inouye. She is HSBC Head of Equity Strategy for the Americas. And Nicole, I want to start with your year-end forecast for the S&P 500, 5,400. You take a look at the S&P 500 right now, we're just below 5,500. What's going to happen in the next 6 months?
Great, thank you for having me on. So I think, first of all, we have to think about the first half of the year. We've had a very nice first half of the year. You look at the S&P, it's kind of had this straight line going up over the past 6 months, a couple little hiccups, but really it's been a straight line moving higher. I think on the second half of the year, we see a little bit more bumps on the road. So I think we're going to see a little bit more volatility. Why is this? First of all, let's look at earnings. So earnings expectations for the second half of the year are elevated. So consensus is expecting double-digit earnings growth. So the bar to beat now gets much higher than what we saw at the beginning of the year. Also, GDP expectations have moved significantly higher. So we're actually now seeing activity surprise on the downside. So again, a little bit harder to get those expectations higher. And then, we have the volatility of the elections in the second half of the year. So I think, we're not ready to move our target yet. We really need to see earnings come in better than expected, get a little bit more comfort on that. And I think the second half of the year, it's going to be a little bit more bumpier than what we saw in the first half of the year.
Well, we're definitely going to get to the election, but I want to talk about what you said about earnings and, of course, expectations for the economy. It sounds like what you're saying is basically that too much good news is priced in right now and expectations are too rosy.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's, if you look at where it's obviously the S&P is above our target right now, and our target was factoring in what we see in terms of earnings growth for this year, which is 11% earnings growth. So, for the S&P to move higher, we need to see one of two things, or we need to see earnings expectations coming in better than expected. And again, we could see this, if we look in the second half of the year, where are we seeing the acceleration in earnings growth is really in the tech Mag 7 stock. So it's the rest of the index. Earnings growth expectations are very high. And we're actually seeing, in terms of the Mag 7 stocks, you're going to see an earnings deceleration. This is really because you have a very hard comp base compared to last year. But if we see this acceleration, especially if you look in the Mag 7 tech stocks come in better than expected, that can actually support earnings growth even higher. But that's something that we really need to see in order to get comfortable in terms of moving our target higher for the end of the year. And obviously we have the Fed and the number of rate cuts. We're only expecting one rate cut in September.
One rate cut in September. And I mean, with that being said, that one rate cut, is that enough to really sort of put the momentum back into small caps, back into those smaller parts of the market that specifically aren't just big tech?
Great question. We don't think so. So we're very positive the S&P. I think for the small caps to outperform, you need to see a series of rate cuts. So we're expecting one rate cut in September, and then the Fed to pause, and then have 3 gradual rate cuts in 2025. Why is that? If you look at inflation, we expect inflation to come down enough for the Fed to be comfortable to cut in September. But because of base effects, we're expecting inflation to look a little bit higher going into year end. So I think when we have the Fed cutting rates in September, obviously there'll be a very nice catalyst for the equity market. But I think the narrative is going to shift from not when and if the Fed will cut, but how much. So if we get just one cut and then a pause, I think the question is going to be, well, how far can rates really go down? And for the smaller cap stocks to rally, we really need to see a longer runway for rate cuts than what we're seeing currently.
So that's one of the known unknowns, right? Of course, what the Fed actually does, how many rate cuts does it actually deliver? The other known unknown, which you already highlighted, of course, is the presidential election that is quickly approaching in November. We saw the first debate last night, and the flash polls would suggest that the perception among the public is that Donald Trump won that debate. But I want to give you a stat that I gave to Steve Whiting at the top of this hour, and that's that the S&P 500 has risen in 13 of the past 15 election years. So is there any reason to think that this year would be different no matter who wins?
Great question. So, for the elections, what we usually see is the volatility picks up really very close to the election. So, usually you see the S&P October and November in election years. That's when you see the volatility really picking up. So, and that's when the market really starts to pay attention to the elections. In terms of the performance, what we've seen historically is normally after an election, the S&P does increase going in from the election into year end. And what we see in terms of who wins and how that works, usually if you have a Democrat president and a split Congress, you do see a better performance in the S&P, or if you have a Republican clean sweep, that's usually the second best performance historically for the S&P. So I'm not going to go into politics, but I think what we've seen historically is usually the S&P does perform well following an election.
All right, Nicole, appreciate that context. Great to speak with you again. Hope to do it again soon. That, of course, is Nicole Inouye of HSBC. Now, coming up, Biden and Trump face off.
We created 15,000 new jobs. We brought out another position where we have 800,000 new manufacturing jobs, but there's more to be done. There's more to be done.
The only jobs he created are for illegal immigrants and bounce back jobs, a bounce back from the COVID. He has not done a good job. He's done a poor job.
More on last night's debate as Democrats hit the panic button next. This is Bloomberg.
The names that move markets are on Bloomberg.
You know, with all due respect and thoughts and empathy and sympathy for the people who are suffering at the moment, and there are plenty. It's not just Ukraine and Gaza, it's in many other corners of the world as well. But I'm constantly surprised by the level of resilience and the capacity to actually bounce back from those traumas. So I have faith in the human beings and their capacity to respond to adversity. We've seen it. You know, look, earlier in the pandemics, we thought that the world was coming to an end, right? It hasn't. Nobody thought that vaccines would come up in such a short period of time. And every time we have to constantly resurrect this spirit of resilience.
But are you hopeful that
I'm always hopeful. Oh, come on, we have to be. We have to be.
Bloomberg. Context changes everything.
Bloomberg has enhanced search on the terminal to deliver what you need when you need it. Now, you can simply type phrases in everyday English in the command line. Compare financials. Find people. Analyze markets. You can enter phrases or ask questions. What do you want to know today? Ask a question or visit SearchGo to find answers now.
From the beating heart of global finance, economics, and politics, and wherever newsmakers are moving markets, Bloomberg brings you conversations that allow for deep discussions and important insights. What do you think the future is for inflation? Is this new normal? Are markets too optimistic? How do you worry about the things that are outside your control? How does the current fighting completely stop? I'm Francine Lacroix, and this is The Pulse, every weekday only on Bloomberg.
Making sure that we continue to strengthen our healthcare system, making sure that we're able to make every single solitary person eligible for what I've been able to do with the COVID. Excuse me, with dealing with everything we have to do with. Look, if we finally beat Medicare.
And President Biden's performance at last night's debate is sounding alarm bells throughout the Democratic Party. And joining us now with more is Anne-Marie Horduran. She is our chief political correspondent and co-host of Bloomberg Surveillance. So, in the aftermath, what are the Democrats saying publicly? What are they saying privately? And how different are those two things?
So that gap is closing. In the past 24 hours, it's really a narrow gap of what they're willing to say out loud and what they're willing to say behind the scenes. There's been whispers about these concerns that we see reflected in the polls of the American electorate, that they just think Joe Biden is too old, at 81 years old, to do another 4 years. And then given his debate performance, how he was looking, how he was talking, a sore voice, coughing, very, very soft as well in his intonations, not really fighting back on Trump. They are literally hitting the panic button. And openly, you hear people talking about the fact that they might have to look for someone else. But this timeline, Libby Cantrell of PIMCO was on earlier, she's basically saying that they have almost 2 weeks to do this. The DNC is in August, the Democratic National Convention, and Biden has already shored up all the votes for that. So really, if he were to step aside and these calls were growing, and this is a Biden camp decision now, really, he would almost need to do what Lyndon Johnson did and make an Oval Office speech, or make a speech and say, I'm going to step aside. Then, of course, there's another whole host of issues, which is who would fill that vacuum. This is what Terry Haynes was talking about earlier. He says he thinks that brings up too many other potential issues, that it's very unlikely that Biden would step aside.
Well, we're going to get to the list of who it could be if it wasn't Biden, but you talked about that timeline and how tight it is, and of course, the complications that would come along with that. I mean, how likely are people saying that, you know, he actually could step aside here and not run?
It's really two different views. There's the one that's Terry Haynes that says it's very unlikely that can happen. And then Greg Valliere, who also talks to people in the markets and really tries to digest Washington for them, he had this out to say in his note. He says his bottom line is that Biden will drop out within days, giving an opportunity to a young, fresh face. So Biden camp today is going to be North Carolina, and then they're going to be in New York. He is going to be so closely watched, who he's meeting with, who he's talking to, who shows up to these fundraisers, and potentially if any of this has broken through to him and his camp. Because last night, what he told reporters was, of course I'm running.
Of course I'm running. That, of course, is the message coming out from the Biden camp specifically. But, I mean, let's talk about who some of those new, fresh faces could be. It seems like California Governor Gavin Newsom, for example, his name has been bandied about quite frequently.
So the first obvious choice is the vice president, Kamala Harris. And she came out last night and she even said Biden, it was a slow start at the start of the debate, but felt like many people in the Biden world, felt like he did try to pick it up at the end, even though for the most part, people felt like many Democrats are, you know, you can look at some of the text messages, felt like this was a disaster. Gavin Newsom is interesting because he continuously comes up as someone potentially that has these presidential ambitions. He always says he doesn't. He's always there supporting the president. But if you look at the video when the debate ended and the press that swarmed him, asking him, are you going to be the nominee now? It was almost instantaneous. Other governors, potentially, Governor Gretchen Whitmer, Governor Pritzker, Shapiro from Pennsylvania, there are names that are being floated, but again, whole host of issues, not just logistically, but also what does this mean for the party? Because there is an heir apparent, technically, with the vice president.
That's very true, of course, that those conversations also center around her as well. But we're talking about, of course, Democrats hitting the panic button, what that camp is doing this morning. Let's talk about the Republican side of things, because I have to imagine they're taking a victory lap right now.
They are taking a victory lap. They feel like in the flash polling, if you look at Frank Luntz and the focus group he had after the debate, it felt like people thought Trump won that. But also, when you look at some of the issues that came up and how Trump talked about them, there was a lot of issues that were riddled with lies, exaggerations, and did he do enough to secure the independents? Did either of them really do enough to secure the independents? So if you're walking away and you're unsure about either of these candidates, did Trump say enough, say on things like abortion, and if you're a suburban woman, did he say enough to make you feel, if that's one of your #1 voting issues on reproductive rights, did he say enough to assuage some of your concerns? So I'm not sure people that are looking at this and looking at the narrow amount of individuals who are going to decide this election. We're talking about a few 10,000s, basically in a few swing states. Did he say enough to assuage those concerns? Which is why for him, the VP pick is going to be so important. And today he's in Virginia, and stumping with him is going to be Governor Glenn Youngkin, someone who's on his list.
There you go. Definitely something to watch there. And just really quickly, I'll ask you the same question that I asked David Gura. Is there going to be a second debate?
Libby Cantrell says maybe there will not be. For Trump, why would you want a second debate? You want these clips of Joe Biden losing his train of thought to continue to circulate social media, continue to circulate TV networks until the election. If you're Joe Biden, you desperately want that second debate. Let's see. It's September.
Yeah, a lot can happen between now and then. Of course, Anne-Marie Horjern, really appreciate that reporting. And let's get to some of the sector price action this morning in the market. We're going to do that with Bloomberg's Abigail Doolittle.
We're looking at a small gain for the S&P 500 right now, Katie, up about 0.4%. More sectors are higher than not, so it is a broad-based gain. We have tech up the most, up about 0.75%. Some of that coming from the Apple strength on our own reporting about iPhones popping, the demand in China by about 40% after discounting. Industrials, energy also higher. To the downside, communication services, utilities, discretionary, and staples. So the day is still young, but the week right now we are looking at a fourth up week in a row. The S&P 500 up just a little less than 1%. Energy, the top sector on the week, up about 3%, in sympathy with oil, also up for a third week. And then it's interesting to note that the S&P 500 media and entertainment index, well, that's up about 2.7%. Of course, we have some of these networks doing well around the debate. Fox apparently had a big viewership spike during the Trump trial in May, but then, of course, also at the debate more recently for all these networks. And then take a look at that, Katie. The SOX down 0.4%, really standing out. That chip strength kind of ebbing away, now down for a second week in a row.
All right, Abigail, thank you so much. Coming up, the market-moving events you need to be watching. That's next. This is Bloomberg.
This is Bloomberg News Now.
News when you want it at the touch of a button.
Another volatile day on Wall Street. We're seeing big moves.
All eyes on Capitol Hill as Democrats and Republicans prepare.
Today's job numbers casting doubt on the Fed's next move. Inflation remains front and center. And that's news when you want it with Bloomberg News Now. Get it 24/7 on the Bloomberg Business app, Bloomberg.com, and anywhere you get your podcasts.
Bloomberg News Now. Context changes everything.
Time now for the trading diary. What you need to be watching. We get Michigan consumer sentiment data at the top of the hour. Fed speak this afternoon. Monday, we'll watch the fallout from the first round of the French elections. Then on Thursday, U.S. markets close for Independence Day, and the UK, it'll be holding its first national election in 5 years. But that does it for the countdown to the open. I'm Katie Greifeld, and this is Bloomberg.
in recent years, you created an institute, the Jane Goodall Institute, and what is that designed to do?
Well, that was started in 1977 when by then I had a little research station and 4 of my students were kidnapped and everything shut down. And so some friends of mine said, well, let's start an institute so that this research can carry on. Bless them. So that was 1977, and it was set up to study, conserve chimpanzees and other animals and educate. And it's developed since then. So it's, you know, we've got 27 Jane Goodall Institutes around the world. And then I realized at some point that the African people living in and around chimpanzee habitats right across Africa were struggling to survive. There was crippling poverty, lack of health and education, moving deeper into the forest, being exposed to diseases like Ebola and HIV from the chimpanzees and vice versa. It hit me. If we don't help these people to find ways of making a living without destroying their environment, conservation won't work.
This is Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney.
The real outperformance has been the U.S. corporate high yield.
Are the companies lean enough? Have they trimmed all the fat?
The semiconductor business is a really cyclical business.
Breaking market headlines and corporate news from across the globe.
Do investors like the M&A that we've seen?
These are 2 big-time blue-chip companies.
The window between the peak and cut changing super fast.
Bloomberg Intelligence with Alex Steele and Paul Sweeney on Bloomberg Radio.
All right, now here we go. Happy Friday, everybody. I'm Alex Steele alongside Emily Griffeo. Paul Sweeney is off today. This is Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. We got you covered from all angles. We have the Supreme Court watch. We are on track to watch that as well. We're also going to talk about Nike with Poonam Goyal, senior U.S. e-commerce and retail analyst, plus Nathan Dean, Bloomberg Intelligence senior policy analyst. We know what the topic is. It's going to be that debate from last night. We're going to get you updated also on all the world and national news, plus Biz Flash. And for that, here's John Tucker. John?
All right, we're being brought to you by Interactive Brokers. Interactive Brokers charging U.S. dollar margin loan rates from 5.83% to 6.83%. Rates subject to change. And you can learn more at ibkr.com/compare. Looking at the major averages, all in the green for the stocks. And we have bond yields. They are lower. It's all due to a cool down in the Fed's preferred inflation gauge, reinforcing bets policymakers are going to have room to cut rates this year. The more policy reactive 2-year yield, that is down right now close to 5 basis points. We're at 4.66 on the 2-year. Energy prices are lower. As a result, energy, best performing industry group in the S&P 500 right now. The biggest drag that's coming from communication services. That's where you have shares of Alphabet. They are down after an analyst downgrade. The S&P 500, 24 points higher. That's up 0.5%, 55.07 on the index. The Dow Jones Industrial Average is up 108 points, and the Nasdaq 100 right now, 150 points higher. That is up 0.75% at 19,938. And some of the individual shares on the move, Alex, you mentioned it at the top of the program. Nike shares, they're sliding right now, down over 18%. Biggest intraday decline since February 2001 after the sneaker maker's first quarter sales outlook that missed Wall Street expectations. We're going to take a deeper dive into that in just a few moments. We check the markets for you all day long right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker. That's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Emily and Alex.
Thank you so much, John Tucker. Appreciate that. Emily, thank you so much for joining me. Paul Sweeney takes Fridays off in the summer. That's his thing.
He has a good life.
Yeah, I mean, it's not too shabby. He takes like 0 vacations all year, but Fridays are his jam in the summer. So thanks for hanging out with me for a couple hours.
Yeah, I'm happy to be here.
So
big day.
Oh, yeah, what's on your mind right now? Like, what are you writing about?
Well, I've been writing a lot about the ETF market, and we're at almost the half point in the year. And you look at the money that has flowed into that space, especially in these names, these chip names. There's one ETF, it's an NVIDIA, like 2X ETF, that's grown from something like $200 million in assets to $5 billion. So there's been a ton of money, a ton of excitement on chip names, but equities more broadly. So that's what I've been watching recently.
Yeah, I'm very excited about talking about that. Plus, Russell 2000 rebalancing. It's a little nerdy, but I like it, and we get lots of volume coming up. All right, let's get to some individual movers. The S&P is up by 0.6%, so we're actually having a little bit of movement. I've been told to watch volume as we head into the close. We have a liquidity event with the rebalancing with the end of the quarter, so it could get pretty exciting. Abigail Doolittle is joining us from Bloomberg. Hey, Abigail, you're looking at Nike, right?
I'm definitely looking at Nike.
The decline is staggering for a company like Nike.
It really is. I mean, down 18%, the worst day going back to 2001. That's the degree of the selling power. But it's worth pointing out that into today, the stock from its 2021 pandemic peak had been down 47%. So it's not as though we're coming from a position of strength. This company really is struggling. Now, what's really bothering investors, beyond the fact that they missed sales in the last quarter by about 2% on some weakness around their Converse brand and some of their lifestyle branding, is this year's, the fiscal year, the full year view. Analysts had been looking for an increase of 2% for sales. Now the company's talking about a mid-single-digit decline. Depending on where that comes in, it could be 7 or 8%. That could basically be a 10% difference in terms of what investors were looking for. And we're not talking about small numbers. It's also worth noting that the big issue here, and this has been for a while, is they need some new products. You have Adidas out there, you have Hoka, you have all these new running sneakers. Nike's no longer the dominant running sneaker, so investors, analysts saying that a turnaround here is just going to take much longer than expected. This stock now, I'm assuming based on the math that I had done earlier, I don't quite have the ability to do it here quickly, down 70% from its pandemic peak. And this is one of the world's bigger companies, or had been at least.
Yeah, it's been really interesting to see the rise of the Adidas Samba.
Yes.
Everyone in New York City is wearing that
what is an Adidas
sneaker.
Samba?
It's like
I have the same question, Alex.
It's the flat sneaker, and then it like the flat bottom, and then it has the
running
stripes.
Sneaker. Yeah, or the
it's
soccer sneaker.
It's so popular, and I really like to wear sneakers with arch support, so I can't wear the Samba, but look it up. It's been so popular.
So I wear the Hoka, and
okay,
that
the
Hoka,
Hokas are
a fair amount of support, and you see a lot of people wearing those now too.
Yeah, exactly. Not a lot of Nike. Anyway, talk to us about DJT, because that stock was up as much as 9%, and now it's pairing gains. Is that all just post, debate, people getting excited about Trump?
So this stock into yesterday, or into today, I should say, had been up about 40% on the week. So this stock was already betting that former President Donald Trump would have a more successful debate night than President Biden, which most of the commentary is suggesting is the case. And today, right now, up about 2%, up 1.6% at the highs. It had been up 8.7%. Either way you look at it, on the week, we're looking at the best week since the end of March. And I suppose this, reflects some excitement about the idea, the possibility that the former president will be reelected in November, and that this is somehow going to help out this company. At that point, you have to then wonder, what are the concerns? Would there be something going on there with his company, his private company here, public company, but with his own name on it? Would there be some sort of conflict of interest, for a lack of a better way to put it? We're not there yet with these shares soaring. And there's also a massive short interest on this stock. I'm just going to take a quick look at what that's actually, it's only 10%, but this stock trades in bigger swings in part because of some of that short interest.
Yeah, it's definitely going to be as a proxy, for sure. It was used that before. All right, let's go to Chewy. You can say Chewy or Petco. Thank you very much, Roaring Kitty, or should I say Roaring Kitty / dog?
Yes, well, today, Chewy, right now, down about 3%. But yesterday, Alex, we talked about this on, of course, the Stock of the Hour. And in a span of 10 to 15 minutes, Chewy went from being down on the day to up more than 30% after Roaring Kitty, also known, or I should say Keith Gill, also known as Roaring Kitty, put out an X post with a picture, a meme of a cartoon dog. People just wildly bid this stock up. They bid Petco up on the idea of, similar to GameStop when he put out, I think it was in mid-April or early May, he put out a picture of somebody playing a video game, and that really set off the meme frenzy again in GameStop. But the idea that he's somehow going to get involved with Chewy. Now, of course, it would be hard, or I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that Chewy had been founded by Ryan Cohen, who is the current CEO of GameStop, so there seems to be some sort of connection there. I was mentioning that Petco also soared on that meme, but we also had GameStop at one point soaring. I think it was like 10% yesterday prior to the meme release, so it's just really interesting to see some of these stocks fly like this. And one of my thoughts is this speaks to all of the liquidity in the system. This should be a message to the Fed, because if there's still so much liquidity in this system, their balance sheet is down about $2 trillion from the $9 trillion peak in the pandemic. But if there's so much liquidity that you can have a stock, a real company with a $10 billion or greater market cap go up more than 30% on the simple meme of a cartoon dog, there's maybe too much liquidity. That then brings in the speaking of cuts. I mean, do they really need to cut if that's the case? There seems to be, at least there's enough liquidity in the financial markets, but is it in Main Street?
I mean, to be fair, the stock is down, so like it was very short-lived in comparison to other of these cycles. All right, Abigail, thanks a lot. Really appreciate it. Thank you very much. We do want to keep you updated on the Supreme Court. We did get one ruling that's coming out. The U.S. Supreme Court reinstated an Oregon city's law banning public camping. This is its first ruling on homelessness in about 4 decades. We're going to get you much more on this with June Grasso in just a moment. Let's go back to Nike and just the level of the stock drop that we're seeing here. Poonam Goyal, Senior U.S. E-commerce and Retail Analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence, joins us now. Poonam, I guess, what would a turnaround for this company at this point look like, and how long would something like that take?
Sure. So I think it's all product dependent. They have introduced new product as of recent, and that product has done well, especially in their Air franchise. I think it's a matter of time. Nike really took its foot off the pedal when it came to innovation since the pandemic, and now it's just starting to push the pedal harder. It won't happen overnight. We think it's going to take at least 6 to 12 months. So this year, their fiscal 2025 will be a wash year. It will be down. And I think we will have to look past that in another 6 months. But I do think that Nike has the ability to bring back innovation. It is the largest athleisure brand. And while it has lost share to Hoka in running and Adidas in the lifestyle category, if they can get the right product out, they can do well. Their dunks were a huge success, but they need more.
Can you talk about how much of the movement that we're seeing in Nike today has to do with company-specific news, and how much of it has to do with traders kind of telling us a signal about the consumer maybe being weaker than perhaps the numbers that we got this morning, the eco data that we got this morning suggesting?
Sure. I would say that the bulk of the move that you're seeing today is company specific. It's not the macro. When I look at the athleisure space, there's a lot of tailwinds in there, especially the sporting events. We have the Paris Olympics coming up, and there is still brand heat for sports to be outdoors that provides a benefit to these athleisure brands. So I'd say while the consumer is being picky and they're choosy, they're still spending where they want to spend. And if you have the product, they will come to you.
But nevertheless, why is it going so poorly? Like, they want to sell direct to consumer and like not do the retail stores as much. But even that strategy didn't work. I mean, how do they fix a problem that has so many tentacles?
The problem is at the core. The problem is at the product. So if they can fix the product, I think the problems almost resolve in themselves. It's not that Nike has lost its brand heat. They still, in basketball, are the most preferred brand. They have the best sports players. They have the highest endorsers. It's really in lifestyle where they're struggling and they've lost share. And you could say in running too. Those are the two categories that they need to bring forward more innovation. So I think the answer to their problem is product, it's innovation. And Nike just needs to push harder, and we'll have to watch execution to see over the next 6 months if they can really deliver on what they're promising.
So Emily, wait, so you do have Nikes or you don't? It's the Adidas ones that you don't have, the Sambas you don't have.
I don't have the Sambas, but it really is incredible. I mean, I like to think that I follow like sneaker trends, and the Adidas Sambas is a lifestyle sneaker that is so popular and has really driven a lot of Adidas's growth. Poonam, are you saying that Nike kind of has to come up with a product similar to that, kind of a product that everyone on the street is, I guess, obsessed with and wants to wear?
Yeah, absolutely. And they did, right? They had the Air Forces, which were a lifestyle shoe. They had their Dunks, which became a lifestyle shoe, but they need more. They need to continue to keep innovating because now they're comping those tough comparisons and they just need more innovation. So it's really, really getting the product right here.
I just, like, how much more can you innovate a sneaker? Like, I mean, this is such a dumb question. I don't wear sneakers. I have a weird foot. I gotta wear Bionics. Like, my feet are old feet. But, I mean, how hard is it to innovate a sneaker?
Well, I mean, the Samba's not really that innovative, right? I mean, I grew up wearing Sambas as a kid. So it's about just getting people comfortable and getting the trend right, getting the look right, the feel right, and being where the customer is and really bringing your brand forward with those customers. Look, Nike's still the largest activewear brand. It's still the dominant player in sneakers. And Hoka and On are very small compared to Nike. So when they grow double digits, it's a small fraction of what Nike's sales are. So I really do think that they can bring something forward and really do well if they get the product. And remember, they also have to endorse the product, right? The product can come out, but then they need athletes, they need celebrities, they need influencers to make that product develop brand heat and catch steam into the marketplace because that's how it works. That's how products sell.
Yeah, they need Emily Griffey to think it's cool, like her and all her buddies. She's gonna be like my cool person on like who knows.
But I want an arch support sneaker.
You have weird feet. Emily, what is it? Oh, it's a life-changing event with your sneaker or lifestyle thing?
A lifestyle sneaker is like
her.
one that
What the hell does that mean?
Not her. She can't wear those. But like, it's just like that's what all her cool friends wear. I have plantar fasciitis. So
like you wear it to hang out, as opposed to a running sneaker that's gonna look more like a.
John has 2 pairs of shoes, so let's just keep that in mind. Hey, Poonam, thanks a lot.
Both
We
of which
appreciate
I
it.
wore in high school.
Poonam Goyal, Senior U.S. E-commerce and Retail Analyst at Bloomberg Intelligence. Let's go back to the Supreme Court here. We're still on Supreme Court watch. The recent ruling, U.S. Supreme Court reinstating an Oregon city's law banning public camping, first ruling on homelessness in 4 decades. June Grasso is Bloomberg legal analyst and host of the Bloomberg Law Show. All right, June, walk us through this decision.
So this was about whether people can be banned from sleeping outdoors on public property when there aren't enough shelters. They don't have anywhere else to go. And the Ninth Circuit had said that was cruel and unusual punishment. That's prohibited under the 8th Amendment. The Supreme Court said, no, it's not. It fits in with the law. It's not, doesn't go as far as the 8th Amendment. And what was at stake here, too, was there was a Supreme Court decision decades ago that said you can't make a status a crime. So you can't make being a narcotic addict a crime. So the question here was, is homelessness, are they making it into a crime? He said they're not. However, it's a 6-3 decision, and it's down ideological lines. So the 3 justices, the 3 liberal justices say that they should have allowed more consideration to the homeless people, and Justice Sotomayor said they have to choose basically between sleep or, how did she put it? 35 pages, so I'm not, let me see if I can find it again. Anyway, so this is a case, the 6-3 decisions are starting to come down now, and we wonder when we talk about why the court is taking so long to come out with these decisions, and that's because you're starting to see more and more 6-3 decisions, usually down ideological lines, but sometimes not down ideological lines. We had some in the past few days that weren't. So, and now why it's taking so long for it to come out is the justices can read from the bench if they want. So This was by Justice Gorsuch, so he read a lot of his statement from the bench. And then if the dissenting justices are really upset about what happened with the case, they also read from the bench. So Sotomayor is reading from the bench as well. And that's why it takes so long to get these opinions out when they are actually in paper boxes in the room. So we know that there are 2 boxes. We know that there are going to be 3 to 4 decisions today.
Okay, so we are definitely waiting for that. So we're definitely waiting for that, June. You'll be sticking with us. We will definitely bring you all those headlines from the Supreme Court as they come out. June Grasso, a Bloomberg legal analyst and host of the Bloomberg Law Show. I just want to point out here, the NASDAQ 100 tops 20,000 for the first time. John, did you do your little confetti with the tissues?
No, sorry.
Oh,
I wasn't here. How's that?
Oh, there we go. He got some confetti with tissues at the end of the second quarter. We're going to talk to Nathan Jean of Bloomberg Intelligence next.
Markets, headlines, and breaking news 24 hours a day on Bloomberg Radio, Bloomberg Television, and the Bloomberg Business app. This is a Bloomberg Business Flash.
And I'm John Tucker in the Bloomberg Newsroom with this Bloomberg Business Flash. Yeah, records all around. S&P 500, NASDAQ 100 trading at records. S&P 500 right now topping 5,500, 5517 on the index, 34 points higher. That's a rise of 0.6%. Dow Jones Industrial Average Nasdaq right now up 187 points, 39,351, so no record there. Nasdaq Composite Index of 149 points, up 0.8%, 18,009. Nasdaq 100, 204 points higher. That's a 1% rise there, 19,990. And the smaller caps, the Russell 2000 right now, that is 13 points higher. That's a rise of about 0.7%. So it's economic data in the driver's seat for now. That was the Fed's preferred measure of underlying U.S. inflation this morning. We saw that decelerated. The swaps traders projecting almost 2 rate cuts this year. Quarter-point reduction fully priced in by November. Bets on a September cut also, they are increasing. Now, at the top of the hour, we also got the Consumer Sentiment Index of the University of Michigan. That ticked up at the same time, and probably more importantly, consumers' inflation expectations, they fell. Once again, the S&P 500, 37 points higher, 55.19. The 2-year yield, 2 basis points lower, and that is at 468. And we check the markets for you all day long, right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker. That's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Emily, Alex.
Thank you, John Tucker. Here we go. The breaking news from the Supreme Court. Supreme Court overturning a Chevron ruling, and this really is a blow to agency power. So this is truly about federal agencies and the current wide berth that they have to interpret unclear laws. And it looks like the Supreme Court has now overturned that Chevron deference. Let's get to June Grasso right away. She covers Bloomberg legal analyst and host of the Bloomberg Law Show. June, we've been waiting for this. Walk us through what this means.
So the Chevron doctrine means, the legal definition of it basically is that if there is an ambiguous statute, an ambiguous law, then deference is given to the agency's interpretation. What it also means is basically, who has more power, the administrators at agencies or judges, experts in the area or judges who have to sort of learn as the cases go on. So we have been suspecting that this court was going to overturn Chevron because conservatives have for years been targeting it, and several of the justices, including Clarence Thomas, have been talking about overturning Chevron. What this means, and this case was just a case, actually it was 2 cases with the National Marine Fisheries where there's a rule that the fisheries have to have observers on the boats and they have to pay for those. And that was being challenged here. And so even though the fact is that they've never actually had to pay for those fines, but theoretically they do. So what the court is saying, and it's the chief wrote this, it's 6-3, again, second 6-3 decision in this case. And, we suspected that it would come out this way because of yesterday's opinion, knocking back the SEC and saying it can't have, in fraud cases, it can't have its in-house counsel. It has to be, people have to be able to go to the federal court and have a trial by jury. So we expected this, and anyone knows there are these people who say this is the, basically the end of the world kind of things. This means that federal agencies are going to, cut back on their regulations. Things are going to be challenged. They do things, all of the regulations, health and safety, consumer regulations, food and drug, that all these are going to be affected by this, and they will, but the question is how much? And that remains to be seen. So, and people on the other side say, well, no, it's not going to really have that much of an effect. We haven't been really using Chevron. And as I've said before, the Department of Labor has already stopped using Chevron as a reason for its regulations in light of this case coming down. So we just don't know what the effect will be, whether it will be huge. And also the Supreme Court hasn't really based any of its decisions on Chevron in a while, so who knows? But it is a blow to agency power, as you said in the first place.
Why do we call it the Chevron deference? Because like you said, this actual case at hand that the Supreme Court is making a ruling on right now didn't have anything to do with the actual company, Chevron. Well, it was just a precedence. Walk us through how we're understanding that.
With Supreme Court precedents, often the name of the case where it's decided is given the title. So Chevron deference comes from a case 4 decades ago involving Chevron. So that's why we call it Chevron deference. It has that name has nothing really to do with the case, the fisheries case here. But that's the name it's had for 4 decades, and that's the way it's referred to. So, you know, if you're in law school, that's what you're studying, the Chevron.
Yeah.
Chevron it's Chevron document, it's called Chevron deference because you give deference to the agency's interpretation.
So does this mean, though, that it's going to be judges that are going to decide the laws versus experts within agencies that aren't elected that decide laws?
Well, that is the intention of the.
But what do judges know about
conservatives
interpreting?
Here. Well, what happens is judges, let's say, you know, they'll learn. For example, you have antitrust cases, right? Judges do all kinds of complex cases. So you have antitrust cases, and they take evidence from both sides. They listen to all the experts, they study it, and then they come out with a ruling. I mean, the Supreme Court, are they experts in the areas that they've been? Homelessness, you know, that's the way the judicial system works. You have judges who are supposedly independent and are independent, and they come to a decision based on the facts and based on weighing both sides of the arguments. But, you know, it's going to make it more difficult for some agency regulations, and you can imagine that. And this was pushed by conservatives and business groups. They wanted to get rid of Chevron. So, and this is all about the, you know, the war on the administrative state, how the 6 conservatives have sort of been bent on not taking down the administrative state, but certainly lessening the power of federal agencies. And as last year, there was a case involving the EPA and its control over water pollution. And the Supreme Court invented a doctrine called the Major Questions Doctrine so that they could take back some of the power that the EPA has there. So it's been going on for a while, but this has been sort of out there as a target of conservatives and business groups. So the impact is, who knows what the impact will really be.
So what exactly how do the businesses feel about this decision? What is the general argument of why the businesses want to overturn this?
Well, they think that agencies have too much power, basically. So they think that this is evening out the landscape, and, you know, it just will make, you know, businesses don't like restrictions, right? I mean, the SEC, that all that we were talking about yesterday was in-house, you know, whether you can have your proceeding in-house judged by an administrative law judge who knows the area, securities, right? Securities lawyer who knows the area versus being able to go to court and have it, you know, a trial. So obviously it's sort of the less restrictions on business, the better it is. So that's, I think, what, you know, and so I haven't been able to read it because I've been talking. But,
but my question, how much of this do you think is about climate and the EPA and the really tough restrictions that have come down through the agencies on interpretations?
That, excuse me, that's one sort of big area here, but it's not just climate that's going to be affected. It's
of course not, but like,
else.
was that really why conservatives were pushing this, or we're not totally clear?
Conservatives have been pushing this for, and what's funny is the Chevron doctrine was a conservative doctrine that was put out 40 years ago, and in time, conservatives have just, you know, don't like it. They don't like the restrictions that it imposes, and so they have attacked it. But so it's just a, you know, where you want less regulation. It's sort of, you know, when Trump came in, remember, less regulation, that's one of his things. I took regulations away, and he had this big stack of regulations. So, and it, you know, also depending on the administration, whether or not regulations are being enforced more, what the regulations are. But this, you know, will affect everything, workplace rules, every rule. And I think that what's going to happen is a lot of agencies are going to do what labor has been doing, which is not rely on that. Say, it doesn't rely on this. This is our agency power. It comes from our agency power. We don't have to go to the Chevron deference.
All right, June, thank you very much. I know we're not done with you yet. Stay tuned because you never know what else is coming out. June Grasso, Bloomberg Senior Legal Analyst, joining us. Let's continue the conversation here. Anthony Sabino is professor at St. John's University Tobin College of Business. And as a reminder, we're looking at the Chevron deference has now been overturned. The Supreme Court throws out decades-old legal doctrine that empowered federal regulations to interpret unclear laws. Professor, thank you for joining us. We appreciate it. You've had some time to read through the opinions. Give us your takeaways here.
Yes, well, first of all, thank you for having me on this important day. This decision is the right decision. It's a very good decision because it honors both the Constitution in terms of its text and its constitutional plan. Now, no doubt we have heard, and we're going to hear a lot more of the wringing of hands and Sturm und Drang about this is the Supreme Court going off the rails, discarding stare decisis, bending agency power, and basically making life very difficult for the agencies. I respectfully disagree, and to use a word I've heard Mr. Biden use quite a lot recently, is that's a lot of malarkey. First of all, it's not a radical decision. It's true to the Constitution's text and to the constitutional plan. For the Supreme Court, for all judges, wherever they may be, their job description can be summed up in two words: judge is judge. Chevron diminished that, okay? It required judges to defer to agencies, and it was keeping judges from doing their jobs, which is to independently, thoughtfully, and of course forthrightly use all their skills, all their wisdom to interpret the law. And as such, Chevron inflicted damage upon checks and balances and separation of powers. In fact, Chevron introduced an imbalance because it gave an advantage to the agencies, to the government side. And again, it's a zero-sum game. If you advantage one side, then by force of logic, you disadvantage the other. What this case now does, Loper Bright, is it levels the playing field. Now everyone comes into court, okay, and has the same situation. The agencies will still be able to advocate for their position. The public, okay, the American citizen, she will still be able to advocate for her position, and the court will listen to both sides, and we will take it from there. As such, now we will have that balance restored as the way it should be. Okay.
How should we understand what this means for businesses? We are Bloomberg. We do follow markets very closely. What's your take on the business implications of this decision?
Right. Hello? Yes. Okay, right. I'm sorry.
Sorry, I'm zooming. I'm zooming in at the same time, okay? But I'll stay on the phone with you. All right.
We got you. Can you hear us?
Yes.
Okay.
All right. Do you want me to stay on the phone or the computer?
This is a great question. I feel like the computer is just fine. All right, so let's get back to that question that Emily was asking in terms of what businesses sort of think about.
Well, businesses are going to obviously welcome this because it removes that unfair advantage. It is not in any way, shape, or form going to radically change how agencies do business. They still have all the enforcement tools available to them that they had previously. They're still going to be able to argue their position in court. They simply will no longer have that unfair advantage of coming in ahead of the game and already being able to basically tell federal judges, well, look, you don't have to apply your skills. You don't have to analyze these ambiguities in statutes. We're the experts. We will do that for you, and just listen to us. And again, that violates separation of powers and checks and balances because you diminish the power of the judges to do the job that they're constitutionally bound to do. And you were expanding the power of the agencies, which are, of course, as we know, part of the executive branch, part of Article 2. So you elevate one branch over the other branch and prevent the other branch, the judiciary, from doing its job. Now, certainly businesses will benefit by having this, but also enforcement actions are going to go around. They're going to continue in the way they have in the past.
Going forward, do you think that laws will then be written with different kind of clarity then to prevent things being held up in courts? Like
exactly.
Okay, so
that's the whole point.
Right. So if that's the case, can you give me an example of something that might have been that might be rewritten or might be written differently now that the Chevron deference is by the wayside?
Okay, well, for example, and I heard you discussing this with June a couple of moments ago, is environmental laws and the regulations promulgated thereunder. Congress, and again, this shifts, if anything, shifts a burden slightly, or basically is a reminder to Congress that they need to do a better job. We have to remember that one of the reasons Chevron came about was that the Supreme Court at that time in 1984 said, all right, well, what do we do when there are ambiguities in the statute? Well, you have a statute that's ambiguous. You have an agency that promulgates a regulation or brings an enforcement action to enforce that statute, notwithstanding the ambiguity. And as such, the court at that time in Chevron said, well, let's listen to the experts, let's listen to the agencies. And that, again, at the time, Chevron was a good decision and rightly decided and worked. But it's been taken too far where now, again, the deference has gotten out of hand and it has increased the imbalance of the favoritism of the agency's view and also, again, basically shutting out, foreclosing judges from doing their job. Now, back to, again, as an example, environmental law, but it applies to securities law, antitrust law as well, because of the controversy presently therein. It's going to compel Congress to write better laws to erase ambiguity, to iron out the ambiguities and the problems and the misconceptions in the words of the statute. So that way you have clear statutory text. Therefore, regulations promulgated by agencies will be just as clear because they're starting from the clear foundation of the statute itself. And enforcement actions in terms of what can be brought and what cannot be brought will likewise benefit from that same clarity. And judges, of course, will have an easier time because, as again, this Supreme Court has said, and the Supreme Court of 200 years has said, we go by the plain English meaning of a statute and we apply it according to its plain English text.
So in theory, though, in theory, businesses should have then more clarity, I think is what you're saying. Like if the law is written more clearly, then the business should say, okay, now I got it. What's the reality, though? Like Congress can barely get, anything done. Are they really going to be able to write more clearly when it comes to certain laws, particularly confusing ones like climate or antitrust?
That's their job. That's what we, the people, elect them for. And if Congress cannot write laws with clarity, then it's up to we, the American people, to exercise our will at the ballot box and put in people who know how to write a clear, unambiguous statute. It's as simple as that. That's the constitutional plan. That's separation of powers. That's checks and balances. So Congress needs to get to work. And in the instances where Congress cannot be, as clear as one might like, the bottom line is that also reflects political compromise because, yes, ambiguities arise in statutes because of the political compromise that is undertaken in the halls of Congress, and of course with the president ultimately signing off and making it into law and so forth. So to that extent, that's a natural part of the process. That's democracy at its best. That's a Republican form of government at its best. All right, you're not always going to get perfectly clear statutes, okay? But again, there's nothing wrong with Congress trying to do that. And if I may, as you say, businesses, but let me broaden that if you allow me. Okay, it's not just American businesses, it's all Americans. All Americans, individual in their personal lives, their personal liberties, business people, business persons, businesses as entities, we're all entitled to statutes that clearly state what the law is. So that way we can look at them and we know that the law is consistent. It's applied to everybody the same way. It's predictable. So when I decide I'm going to take a certain course of action, I know what the legal result is going to be. That's part of America. That's the way it should be. And once again, Local Right Today restores that balance by letting judges judge.
All right, Professor, we hope that plays out that way. Anthony Sabino, professor at St. John's University, Tobin College of Business. Just as a reminder to update you on this breaking news, the Supreme Court overturns a Chevron ruling in a blow to agency power, throwing in a four-decade-old legal doctrine that empowered federal regulators to interpret unclear laws. And now that goes to judges and then back to Congress to write very clear laws. I also want to point out, thank you, Mike McKee, that this does not apply retroactively, that anything that was ruled under the Chevron deference over the past 40 years is still subject to the way things were. So just keep that in mind as we go forward. We'll keep you updated on any more decisions that come across from the Supreme Court today. In the meantime, let's go get a biz flash with John Tucker. John?
And it's records all around. You can credit signs of inflation cooling. So that's reinforcing bets the Federal Reserve is going to be able to start cutting interest rates this year. Treasury yields, they are lower. The more policy reactive 2-year yield, about 3 basis points lower. That's at 4.68. The 10-year, the benchmark, right now unchanged, 4.29 on the 10-year. In addition, we also got at the top of the hour evidence that consumers expect prices were going to climb at an annual rate of 3% over the next year. That's down from 3.3%, so cooling inflation expectations on the part of consumers. Again, the S&P 500 extending this year's advance right now 15% year to date. NVIDIA is among the stocks leading the mega caps right now. NVIDIA shares, they are up 1.3%. And then on the other side of the ledger, you have shares of Nike down 19%. That comes after a disappointing outlook from Nike. S&P 500 topping 5,500 for a time there. Right now, 55.12, 29 points higher. That is up 0.5%. The Dow Jones Industrial Average, 238 points higher. That's a rise of 0.6%. The Nasdaq 100, 138 points higher. That is up 0.7%. It was at 20,000 there. Right now, 19,931. And we check the markets for you all day long, right here on Bloomberg Radio. I'm John Tucker, and that's your Bloomberg Business Flash. Emily, Alex.
All right, thanks so much, John Tucker. This is Bloomberg Intelligence Radio. I'm Alex Steele alongside Emily Griffeo, who just got a nice dose of Supreme Court awesomeness on her Friday as she helps me out. Paul Sweeney is sitting on a beach off today. This is Bloomberg Intelligence. We bring you all the top news in business and finance and economics through our lens of our Bloomberg Intelligence analysts. They cover 2,000 companies and 130 industries worldwide. Let's go to one of them right now. Nathan Dean, Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Policy Analyst. Lots of stuff happening in D.C. We are keeping an eye on those Supreme Court decisions, but we cannot lose sight of the complete disaster that was yesterday and that debate between President Trump and President Biden. I think the big question today, Nathan, is what does it look like to get Biden off the ticket? Like, legally, how does that actually happen?
So it's going to have to come from the president himself. I mean, this is going to be a decision that he's going to have to make. And I think that, you know, we'll see over the weekend as he's fundraising and meeting with advisors. But as of this morning, he was even saying to journalists that he is going to be on the ticket and he's looking forward to a second debate in September. Now, the way it would work is that if President Biden were to decide that he's not going to run, then we go to the convention and the delegates would have to figure it out. Now, President Biden already has enough delegates to secure the nomination, but if he were to say, I'm not going to run, he could release those delegates to then vote for whoever. But ultimately, then it would become a race of who wants to be the nominee for 3 months before the election and trying to take down President Trump. It's going to be very messy. You would have Kamala Harris, the vice president. You would have a lot of governors probably thinking about it. But if this were to happen, and it were to happen soon, it's going to be something that we haven't seen since Lyndon Johnson in 1968.
Nathan, how soon must a decision be made?
Good question.
Almost July. Biden doesn't seem to have a lot of time here.
No, but he does have the advantage that the Democrats are going second in terms of the convention. So the Republicans are meeting on July 15th. The Democrats aren't meeting until August. So really before the convention, there's a lot of bit of time in terms of at least the logistics of getting on the ballot. If this were to happen after the election, essentially Democrats would have to go to the polls and vote for Joe Biden knowing that they would get somebody else. But if President Biden were to decide tomorrow that he's decided he's not going to run, you're going to see a scramble amongst the Democratic Party to try and figure out, okay, is Kamala Harris the next nominee? You know, she isn't polling all that well against President Trump on a one-on-one race. You know, is Governor Newsom, Governor Pritzker, Governor Whitmer, you know, the governors, I think, would be able to put their hands up there and say, we're interested. So you would almost have like this, like, you know, reality TV show, if you will.
Yeah, be like a total free-for-all.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then ultimately it comes down to a vote in Chicago, which, you know, the last time, Chicago obviously doesn't have the best reputation when it comes to Democratic conventions and open conventions, but, you know, it would be quite a show in August.
Hey, Nathan, what do you think is realistically going to happen?
So look, this decision is going to come from President Biden and President Biden himself. I mean,
Sure.
It is extremely difficult for a politician, Republican or Democrat, who has served their entire life and is used to being a fighter, to then say, you know what, I'm going to take a step back and it's time for me to move on. And so, you know, we've seen this with a lot of other politicians, both in Congress and, you know, the executive branch. Now, I think it comes down to two things. One, if President Biden believes that last night was just because of the cold and that he can then change the narrative in the next few months, he's going to stay in. If there's something more serious that President Biden begins to believe that there is something that, you know, that this is an issue, then I think eventually he may say, we're going to step out.
All right, Nathan, we got to leave it there. Thank you so much for that. Nathan Dean, Bloomberg Intelligence Senior Policy Analyst, and it is definitely the Supreme Court decision day. The latest is the Supreme Court backs the January 6th defendant, curbing the use of the Enron law. Remember, nearly 300 defendants, including Donald Trump, were charged under this 2002 law that grew out of the Enron collapse regarding people who obstruct an official proceeding. And it looks like the Supreme Court has backed the January 6th defendant. June Grasso, Senior Legal Analyst, is still with us. June, what does this mean?
Well, it means that some defendants are going to have their cases trimmed back, and this also affects Donald Trump because he's been charged with this same crime. So it's going to affect a lot of January 6th cases. I think very few of the January 6th defendants just have this charge that they're facing. So if they've had a trial already, they'll probably still be.
And is this charge
serving time.
specifically against preventing approving